The paintbrush tool in Affinity is perhaps the most underrated and underutilized tool in all of Affinity. And I think that's perhaps because people just don't fully understand it. It's not just for digital painting. You can combine it with other tools in Affinity to apply texture, to apply lighting, to apply all sorts of cool effects to your work. So in this video, I'm going to cover all the paintbrush tool settings and options in depth so that maybe you too can start to take full advantage of this amazing tool. Now, a warning. Sometimes I get comments on the channel that tell me that I talk too much, that tell me to get to the point. And hey, I get it. I don't mind. Critique away. Critiques are valuable to me. But in this instance, my goal is not brevity. My goal is a super deep dive into the paintbrush tool in Affinity. My goal is for the people that watch this video to then be in the top 1% of Affinity users when it comes to understanding this tool, because I want you to love it as much as I do. I want you to have the creative options that I have. But I get it. Most people aren't going to watch all of this video. So I've also created a free guide to the paintbrush tool, which you can download in the comments below. And I've also created timestamps so you can jump to any part of this video, any area where you need to brush up your skills, or you just don't understand something. I have links down below in the description of this video, so go ahead and jump to whatever part of the video you want. Or you're welcome to go watch a different video that's a better fit for you. That's fine too. But if you really want to learn about sub brushes and brush nozzles and the real difference between flow and opacity and how to apply texture to a brush and how to use brushes with other tools in Affinity for creative effects, then this is the video. We're going to get into all the nitty-gritty, so let's get right to it. So where do we find this paintbrush tool? Well, we find this paintbrush tool under the Pixel Studio. So right down here, we have this paintbrush tool. And I don't want you to confuse this with the paint mixer brush, because that's something a little different. We're not going to talk about that in this lesson. And also under the Vector Studio here, if we go under the Vector Studio, there is a path brush tool, and there also is a pencil tool. Those are a little different, so we're not going to talk about those. We are going to focus on the paintbrush tool here that lives within the Pixel Studio. So I just want to be clear about that up front. Now, if I just hover over this paintbrush tool for a second, it'll bring up a little description, and we see that this does paint with raster brush strokes, so that's important. We're putting down pixel-based strokes. And then it's got some other descriptions here about some keyboard shortcuts we can use. I think it's a little confusing the way it words this, but I will get into this and make sure you understand what all these means, because some of these can be helpful, and I'll teach you some other tricks as well. Okay, once we have the paintbrush tool selected, there are two other main areas we're going to have to pay attention to. The first is the contextual bar up here. Now this contextual bar is going to change based on whatever tool we have set. So when we have the paintbrush tool, we're going to get these settings up here. And then the second area is we're going to need to find our brushes panel. Now by default in Pixel Studio, it's going to live here over here next to layers, channels, and then brushes, this brush panel right here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it out here and maybe expand it on this side of the screen just so I can see it a little bit better, because this brush panel you're going to have to locate, because you're going to work with this a lot when you're using the paintbrush tool, because this is where you're going to store and organize your brushes. Choose what brush you're going to use. Now if we look at the brush panel right now, we'll see that there's a red outline around this brush that lets me know this is the currently selected brush. Now there's also a little red circle up here in the upper left that's kind of important also, but we're going to come back to that in a little while so you see what that means. And the other thing here is we could see that this brush is within the basic category. So within the basic category I have all these brushes currently, and if I click on a different one, we see how it changes, and now we have this blue selection around it. Now we noticed before it was red and I had that red circle. Again, I'm going to let you know what that red color means, but usually you're just going to have some sort of outline around the brush to let you know what the current selected brush is. That's the brush that you're going to be currently using. So if I were to select this round brush here and then draw on screen just by clicking with my left mouse button, holding it down, drawing, I'm going to be painting with that brush. If I were to choose a different brush here, then now I'm clicking and I'm painting with that brush. Now we're going to talk about all the brush settings in a minute, but first you just have to understand how you select a brush. Now by default inside of Affinity, you're usually going to start with a lot of different brush categories as well. So right now it's under basic, but I can come to up here, use this drop down arrow and see all the different categories in here. So we have dry, media, engraving, inks. So if I went under my ink brushes, let me just grab and show you a few different strokes, because just by default inside of Affinity here, you really have lots and lots of different brushes. Here's an oil brush here. So here's a classic oil brush. So really you have lots and lots of really cool brushes. Here's one that sprays and splatters. So just by default, you have a lot of really cool, interesting brushes that already come preloaded. Now, even more important than that, I'm going to teach you how you can make your own brushes, how you can make adjustments to these brushes. And as you do, you're going to be able to come up here and you're going to be able to create different brush categories. So if I go up here to the very top now, I can see that I have one here called Brush Lessons, another one called Mountain Brushes. Here's one I called Greg's Fave Brushes. So you can name them whatever you want. And as you create categories like this, it's important to know how these get organized. So if I come up here and go to the brushes menu in this top left arrow here, we can see that I can create new categories, I can rename them, I can duplicate that, and then I can sort them by date added or by name. Well, I like to sort by name, and if we take a look at my brushes again, we can see that these categories are in alphabetical order, and then also take note, if you start something with a number, that's going to appear even before your letters. So just knowing that things are in alphabetical order, you can very easily control which brushes appear at the top of your menu. You can rename things so they get bumped to the top or repositioned. So that really gives you an easy way to organize your brushes. There are some other options in this brush panel menu which we'll come back to, but for now let's just go back to that basic category and let's just choose a basic hard round brush. So I'm going to choose this one right here, and then I'm going to come back here on screen and let me just hit Control A to select everything. First of all, you're going to be painting on whatever your active layer is. So let me just come back here so I can see my layers panel. I have this brush pack practice layer. That's what we're painting on currently, but I'll just hit Control A to select everything. That would be Command A on Mac, Control A since I'm on Windows, and then the delete key just to clear that layer. So now I have a clean layer, and now I can left click with my mouse button, keep it held down, and start drawing on the screen. Now this is a good moment for a quick pause because you heard me say left click with my mouse button, and while you can use your mouse and get a ton out of this paintbrush tool, as a precursor to all of this, when you're using the paintbrush tool, you can just use your mouse and you can get some amazing results. So you can do a lot just with a mouse alone, but you should know that a lot of these settings have pressure sensitivity and other options that you can only take advantage if you have something like this. So this is a Wacom tablet. So basically you have this pen and stylus and you draw directly on the pad itself. And so then you can take advantage of things like pressure sensitivity. So a lot of people pick up something like this. They have ones like this where you draw directly on tablets, other ones like Cintiqs where you draw directly on the screen. So that is something you may want to consider if you really get into this brush tool and you want to take full advantage of all the options. Now I went ahead and set up an Amazon store with some links to some of these tablets and Cintiqs, which I like. You can go from spending a little bit to really spending thousands and thousands of dollars. So I will place a link below. Now that's an affiliate link, so I can earn commissions if you buy to that page. But what you should know is if you're just getting started, I really recommend going cheap. Get a cheap option. You can pick up a tablet for under $50. That's a great way to try it out, see if it's something that makes sense for you. And then if you advance and you really get into that and start to use it in a professional workflow where it's earning income for you, then you can always upgrade later. So let's start by talking about the main brush settings that you control up here with this contextual menu. Now the first of these is width. I can see that if I just hover over this. I like to think of this as brush size, but officially it is called width. So right now this is set to 56 pixels. So that's the size of my brush head. And if I click and drag, that's going to be the size of my stroke. But I can come up here and I can change this. If I want to make it bigger, something like 143, we can make a bigger brush stroke. If we want to make this smaller, we can make it even smaller. So you can come up here and control the brush size. Now an easy keyboard shortcut which you will want to learn is just the right and left bracket keys. So very easily using those right or left bracket keys on the fly, I can just raise and lower the size of my brush, and that's just using that right and left bracket keys. So that is super helpful. The next two settings we have up in this menu are opacity and then flow. And I'm going to talk about these two together because both of these control how much ink or paint you're putting down at one time. And a lot of people get these confused, or a lot of people think they are the same. Well, they actually have one slight difference, and that slight difference can make a huge difference in terms of the results you get. So it's very important that you understand this. So let's start with opacity here, and I'm going to set this opacity down to 25%. So when I do that, it's not going to put all this black color on the page. It's only going to partially put down color. So what we're going to see is this gray color. So if I click and drag, we're getting this gray color. Now I say click and drag, that's because I have my mouse out currently. I also have a pen tool, so if I were using my pen tool and my tablet here, then every time you touch the screen and you don't lift your pen, that's going to be a stroke. So when you're painting on canvas, you start a brush stroke, your brush is touching the screen, and then as I do that, notice it's staying the same gray color. Now suddenly, I unclick my mouse or I lift up my paintbrush or my pen tool, then suddenly when I start another stroke, it's going to be that same gray, but when I cross over areas that already have ink or paint down, we see it gets darker. So with this opacity setting, it is additive at the stroke level. So every time you make a stroke here, any areas that you cross over that you've already done before, we're going to see those get darker. But if I'm just painting in one stroke, as long as I don't lift, it's going to stay consistent across the area of that stroke. The moment I lift it up, click again, or touch to the paper again with my pen tool, we see that now suddenly it has that additive effect. Now, let's go and let's pull that back up to 100. Now let's do the same thing with flow. So I'm going to set the flow down to 25%, same level we did before, and you can use the sliders or you can type it out. So I'll type out 25. Now I want you to notice how this reacts differently. I'm going to click a hole and hold. I'm going to start a stroke. I'm maintaining that stroke. And notice now, anytime I pass over the same area, that color builds up very quickly, and very quickly it becomes black. So this is acting a lot different than the opacity tool. Now to understand why this is working so much differently, we have to understand how brush strokes are put together here inside of Affinity. And to do that, we're going to take our first foray under this More tab here in Affinity, because we have all these settings up here and we're going to come back to these, but under this More tab, we have even more brush settings, and there's one setting under here which is going to be crucial to understanding how sort of a brush stroke works in Affinity. So first, just to clean things up here, let me just hit Control A and delete just so we have a clean canvas. And now I'm going to go ahead and work inside here. So we can see that my brush is a circular shape. However, if I click and hold, then we sort of get this line. And this makes sense. If you had a circular paintbrush and you put it on canvas and you dragged it across, it's going to create a line like this. How does this work in Affinity? Well, what happens here is that your brush is really just a stamp that is repeated. Now I can see that if I come in here under this main, this More tab, and under the general setting, we have this spacing option. If we drag out this spacing, we can see that that circle shape is getting spread out. So if I were to come and make a brush stroke now, it's just putting down a stamp of that circle shape every so often. Now if I drag that spacing way down, that basically it's going to barely move, and then it's going to put down another stamp. So when I go like this, I may have just put down hundreds and hundreds of circles here in this one brush stroke, because I put this spacing really close together. So that circle is just being repeated again and again. And so when I do that with a 25% opacity, 25% flow, we can see how very quickly, that builds up the black, because in one area, there are lots and lots of stamps, and flow is additive at the stamp level. If I go back here and take this all the way up, and then we come up here and we change this back to opacity, then remember at the opacity, I can spread this out and I can have it overlap a little bit, and I can go back and forth. And this is all happening at the stroke level with opacity. It has the additive effect at the stroke level. But if I take this, boom, and I bring back the flow down to like 25%, now suddenly we can see what's happening here with it spaced out like this. We can see that the additive effect for flow happens at the stamp level, the singular brush head level. So hopefully coming in here and playing with this spacing option helps you understand what is happening with the flow setting here and why it's acting so much differently than the opacity setting, okay? Because they both control how much paint you're putting down, but there's this very important difference where it's determined whether it's happening at a single brush stroke level or whether it's happening at the stamp level. Because in one brush stroke, you might be putting down hundreds or even thousands of these individual stamps of your brush shape. So hopefully that clarifies to you the difference between opacity and flow. So as you're experimenting with this flow setting, you're going to have to keep in mind that it's directly tied to spacing. Change the spacing and it's going to change a lot what's happening on screen. And also because things build up so quick at the stamp level, that's why sometimes you're going to want to start with a flow setting that is really low, sometimes even as low as 1%. So let me put in 1% here, and now suddenly, because it's building up at the stamp level, it still builds up fairly quickly, but we don't immediately go to black because now suddenly I've lowered it down to 1%, so I really can put down a lot of stamps before it starts to go to full color. So just all things to keep in mind when working with opacity and then with this flow setting. So low flow brushes can be really great in something like digital painting because you really can simulate that buildup of paint. So here it is with a simple cloud brush, and this is something that's actually really easy to do once you understand how brushes like this work. So you really can create some really realistic effects, something like a cloud in the sky like this, just by understanding settings like flow. The next setting we have up here is brush hardness, and with the hardness of 100 we get a nice crisp stroke where we have this clearly defined edge to our brush. But if we want a softer edge, if we want a feather at the edge of our brush, then suddenly we can start to lower this setting down. So if I put it in somewhere in the 50% range, now we can start to see we have this blurred soft edge to our brush. And how much of that edge is getting blurred, and the bigger the feather area, the lower the setting up here. So if I take this all the way down to 0, now we can notice we have this nice soft edge to our brush. Now brushes with soft edges like this can be very helpful when it comes to blending areas, and I think I can best show this with a simple example, and this example will also start to illustrate how brushes can be used for way more than just drawing on screen. They're also hugely important when it comes to tasks like photo editing. So let's take a look at this photo. Nice fall scene, a cool photo, but obviously the star of this photo are the kids, so maybe we want to draw the attention to them even more. So I have this nice black brush here, but I wouldn't just paint on the screen here. That wouldn't make any sense. But where brushes become really powerful is when you start to pair them with the other tools here inside of Affinity and your knowledge with how things like masking works. Now, if you need a refresher on how things like selections and masking work in Affinity, I can post some links down below. But what we're going to do here is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add an adjustment layer. So I'll choose this adjustment layer icon and I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. Now, adjustment layers are great because you can do non-destructive editing. You can make a change here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this slider and I'm going to lower the midtone. So I'm going to lower the amount of brightness in those midtones. So something like that, don't have to be too heavy-handed, but something like that. But when I do that, it's applying that universally across this entire photo. So when I turn that on, we can see it's darkened all areas where there are midtones. What I want to do is be able to selectively apply those edits. So this is where we're going to use a mask and then we're going to use a brush. So what I'll do now on this curves adjustment layer is I'm just going to put a mask right here. So we have this mask layer, so I'll go ahead and turn that on. And then now what I can do is I can come in here and I can paint out areas where I don't want this mask to apply, or I can paint in areas where I do want it to apply. Right now it's doing everything, but really I want to keep this central area bright. And also we can see how there's naturally maybe this swatch of light here that I can take advantage of. So right now I have this mask, and if I expand this here, we can see a mask. When it's white, it shows through, so it's showing all of my curves adjustment. If I apply black paint, I can hide this curves adjustment in certain areas of my photo. So right now, if I just came in here and my hardness is set to 100, so if I start to paint here, now that's going to be very obvious because we can see how hard that edge is. That's not going to be what we want. So I'm going to hit Control Z a couple times to undo those keystrokes. Now what I'll do is I'll take this hardness down all the way to 0. Then I'm going to make my brush even bigger. So let me come in here and make my brush even bigger. And then I'm going to sort of follow the swatch of light across here and just do a sweep across here and a sweep across here. And so now if I turn that curves adjustment on and off, we can see how it's only darkening in the top and the bottom. And I'm using that to push focus towards my subject. So we can see this is the before, and then this is the after. And if we take a look at that mask, we can see because I use that feathered brush, I could come in here and selectively paint where I want that adjustment to show through. So this is the power of the brush engine And the paintbrush tool, when you get into things like photo editing, it really gives you fine control, which is crucial and helps you just direct the eye of the viewer by doing things like this, where you're not using a brush alone, you're using it in combination with some of the other adjustment tools you have here inside of Affinity. And of course, this curves adjustment is non-destructive, so at any time I can come in here, I can change it, I can fool around, I can experiment with maybe making the outer area brighter, lower, anything I want to do. And also same thing with the mask, I can come in here, switch from white paint to black paint, add whatever I want to the mask to continue to make fine-tuned adjustments. Next, if we continue past the hardness setting, we have this more tab and this pressure tab. We're going to circle back to those. Let's go to these stabilizer settings. So with that turned off, if I were to try to sort of write my name using a mouse here, it would be very tough to keep smooth the letters because you just can't really get too much control dragging your mouse. I'm not good at it. I don't know anybody that's really good at it with their mouse. Now I also have a 16-inch Wacom Cintiq, so this doubles as a monitor and something I can write directly on. So if I try it this way, I get a much smoother result because these are the natural motor skills for writing I've used my whole life, so it's just easier to get a smoother result. Now, regardless of whether you're using your mouse or some sort of drawing tablet with a pen tool, there are stabilizer options up here that can potentially help you draw smoother lines. So let's turn off this layer for a second. I'm just going to add a new layer and let's try this again. I'll start with my mouse, but this time I'm going to turn on the stabilizer tool up here just by checking this box there. And then when you check this here, you have two different modes. You have rope mode and you have window mode. And then you have a setting here where you can set up the rope length. And then these are different settings here, but these three settings right here, these all have to do with the stabilizer checkbox here. So let's make this bigger just so we can see it a little easier when we first start out. And I have it set on rope mode here. So by default, you have to be on rope mode or you have to be on Windows mode. So it's kind of hard to see that, but there's just this little icon that indicates which is checked on. So now when I go to draw, it's almost like you're pulling your brush head with a rope. So you'll notice when I first click, I don't see anything on screen except for this little rope here. And then once I pull that taut, then it's going to start to create the stroke. So you're sort of dragging around and you're pulling the line by pulling your little brush head using this rope. Now let me hit Control Z to undo that and I'll try to draw out my name. So one thing you have to keep in mind when you do this, based on the size of your rope, the length of the rope, there is going to be this little delay. So if I start to draw the G now, I've already started to make that curve. So you sort of have to account for that delay and realize your brush head's not going to move until you pull the rope taut. So if I pull it up here and we circle around, and we do this G. So you sort of have to have a little patience with this and just keep in mind that you have to wait for that lag. So again, pulling down, going up here, setting the top part of that. But we can see already that this is with my mouse and this is way smoother than I would be able to get without using this stabilizer setting. So the stabilizer setting, it does take some practice, but you can get a much smoother result. Now, let me just go ahead and hit Control Z to undo all that. And then we'll go up here and we'll play with these settings again. So let's leave it on rope mode, but let's take the length of the rope and let's make it a lot smaller. Let's make it 22 pixels. So now suddenly I'm working with a much smaller rope. So the delay is just much smaller. It's working the same way, but we have a smaller delay. So it's a little closer to using a normal brush, but you can still get a smoother line. So whether you use a longer rope setting or a shorter rope setting, sort of depends on preference. And I find if you're doing big sweeping arcs like this, then a longer rope sometimes works great. But sometimes if you need a little bit more curves and other things, then sometimes you might want to shorten that a little bit. The biggest thing is just understanding how this works and playing with it and getting comfortable. Let me just hit Control A and delete everything here. Let's look at how this is actually working. So it kind of makes sense that it's smoothing the line, because if I'm going along and I'm dragging something here by pulling the rope when the rope is taut, now if my hand jitters like it might do trying to move a mouse, if I jitter inward here, it's not actually moving the line because I no longer have the rope taut. So because the rope needs to be taut for it to be moved, it just has a good way of smoothing out your line, because if you jitter a little bit this way and that way, that's when the rope itself is not actually taut and you're not actually moving the brush head. So it is going to result in a smoother line. Now it's not perfect, and there are two things you have to work on and really practice, because it just takes time to be able to control this. The first is when you go to start your stroke, the tendency is to go ahead and make a turn but you haven't actually started moving your brush head yet. So you have to factor in that little delay at first and make sure you move and get your rope taut before you actually start to make the arc of the shape you want to make. Now the other thing is here, if you're trying to go out here and draw sharp angles, then this tool, you're going to have to keep that lag in mind, because if I go up here and just try to jut to the left and suddenly I'm not making those angle turns the way I want to. Let's say I wanted to make a right angle. What I'd have to do is I'd have to come up and pull up, and then I'm going to pull it back down to get rid of the taut in the rope. Then I'm going to pull it in a different direction, boom. So sometimes you have to go backwards and then change direction, go backwards and change directions, go backwards and change directions. Because if you're just trying to make that quick movement, then the rope has to catch up. So it just takes practice learning this tool, and it's not right for every situation. Sometimes, especially if you're using a pen tool, you might just want to be making a natural stroke with your pen tool. But even with the pen tool, sometimes when making that really smooth arc, those really smooth curves, sometimes this can be helpful. So it's just something you have to play around with. Now let me hit Control A and delete that. There is another option up here, and this other option is called window mode. And if you read this, it says the input positions are averaged over a flexible window, produce a smooth flowing input. So that language is a little confusing, but basically what you need to understand about this setting here is it has the same length slider where you come in here and you sort of change the length of sort of a string, except it's not quite working the same way as a string, because we'll watch if I set this all the way to 128 and I try to go forward and then I go backwards, then it continues to move. There's no like moment where like suddenly you have a string, and that string of course could go slack and then you're not moving the line. This is always going to be moving the line. So it's really just taking an average of your mouse movements, and it's using that average to sort of control the movement of your stroke. So it can work, it can produce a smooth line, but again, it's about practicing and understanding that that is working differently than that string rope technique, okay? So two stabilizer tools, they both can be helpful, not right for every situation, but they can be helpful. Certainly if you're using a mouse, they can be really helpful because it's harder to get a smooth stroke with a mouse, but even with a pen tool or a tablet of some kind, it can be helpful. Just play around and you'll find right situations where these stabilizer techniques can be super helpful. The next brush setting we have is a drop down up here where you can set a blending mode for a brush. So this just works the same way you can set a blending mode for the layer itself. You can actually set a blending mode for your brush, and it's going to work with any paint that's already on the canvas for that layer. So just to see how this works, let me go ahead and lay down some different brightness values. So we're going to put down some black, some slightly lighter gray, some sort of mid-tone gray here, and then let's go a lot lighter, something closer to white, and even lighter value there. So if I had these different values on the canvas, right now when I'm painting with one thing, it's just going to paint over something else if I move over another area. However, if I were to come up here and switch the blending mode, so let's switch it to darken. So when you're on darkening blending mode and you're putting down something, it's only going to show through if it's darker than the layer that's already there. So if I were to take this and choose something in the gray value up here, it's going to paint over this area here because it's darker, and I keep going, it's going to paint over this because it's darker, but that's something when I hit these other two values, they are already darker, so I can paint right up to them, but going over top of them, I'm not going to see any change because it's only darkening areas on the screen. So when there's already a darker color tone, it's not going to affect that area. So that could be very helpful if you have some color like this that you want to protect and you want to switch your blending mode up here. Now, that was all one brush stroke, I did that, but the same thing happens if I were to lift and try to paint again. It's going to protect those areas that are already darkened, already darker than the paint I'm using because I am in darkening mode. Contrastingly here, if I went over here and switched this in the lighten mode, and then suddenly now I could paint over these top areas, but then when I get to some of these lighter areas on the bottom, it's going to protect those and it's not going to paint over those areas. So I won't go through all the different blending modes here, but once you understand these blending modes, you'll understand how you can use them effectively to have even more control with the brush that you're using. The next option we have up here is just a little button here for checking on and off wet edges. Now I think it's a little misnamed because let me turn it off for a second. So I have black as my brush color. So now it's just going to put down the full value of that black if I don't have wet edges turned on. But if I turn it on, now suddenly it's only applying sort of partial paint the first time, and then it's going to have this slight buildup effect as you apply different strokes. So this is really just working at the stroke level, much like opacity. So if I turn off the wet edges here, and then let's just take the opacity down to around 75 or something like that, and we can see that this is going to work very similar to what I just did. So I really don't use the wet edges option very much because it works at the stroke level just like opacity, except you just have this one check button. Here with opacity, I have this slider where I can set all sorts of different levels. So yeah, why wouldn't I just use opacity? So the opacity option is what I tend to prefer over using this wet edges option, but you do have this option up here for turning on and off wet edges. And if for some reason you're putting down a stroke and it doesn't look like full color, full value that you expect, that's when you might want to just check and make sure that that is not turned on, unless of course you want it turned on. Now that helps us transition nicely to the next button up here, which is this Protect Alpha button. Now alpha is really just a fancy way of saying the transparency levels of the pixels on screen. Now for that last exercise, I was using a black brush the whole time, and I was using the wet edges and the transparency features up here. And because of that, I know that these areas I'm seeing different lightness values because of partial transparency. Now, it could have been different had I come in here, and let me take the transparency or the opacity setting all the way back up. Wet edges is not turned on. I could put down some black paint here. I could change my color to a different gray, put down some different gray, and then some even lighter gray. Now suddenly these strokes may look the same, but they're actually quite different. And I'm only going to see that difference if I turn off the background layer here. Now I actually have the document by default set up here with a non-transparent background. So go under document setup, make sure I have transparent background. Now I can actually turn off any layers behind and see that these layers here, these are solid, these are opaque, but these layers here, they have some levels of transparency where you can see through to the layers behind. And that is very important because that gets to the heart of what alpha is. When we say protect alpha up here, we're just talking about protecting the levels of transparency that exist. So most places here are fully transparent. This one is fully opaque here, and then these other strokes here have some varying levels of transparency. So to see how that comes into play now with Protect Alpha, I'll go ahead and turn that white background back on, but we're going to come back up to this layer here where we have all these different strokes. And again, we're going to see how this works. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to turn on Protect Alpha. So it's going to protect the transparency levels that exist on this screen. So let me go and choose something like a blue color. Now, if I try to paint it here, nothing's going to happen because there is 0% visibility on that. That's fully transparent. So it's keeping that. However, if I keep doing my strokes and then suddenly I go over this level here, we can see it's starting to put down this slight color here. Actually, let me get a much more distinct blue. So here's, we'll be able to see even better. It's starting to put down that blue, but at the transparency levels that exist there. If I come over here, same thing. It's protecting the transparency levels that are here. Now, what's going to happen when I go over this stroke here? It's going to turn fully blue because we put those strokes down differently, and so they were fully opaque, and so it's honoring that. So this is what that Protect Alpha does. It's going to look at the transparency levels that exist currently on a layer, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to honor that, and it's going to maintain that. So if you wanted to fully recolor a layer to just one color but different values, so in other words different values, so different brightness values of those colors, you could come in here, you could turn on that Protect Transparency and go over your layers like this with a brush. It's called Protect Alpha, but that's really just another way for Protect Transparency. So I want you to understand that, and it's going to be helpful if you understand how this works because there are times when this could be useful. Whenever you first select a brush here in Affinity from the Brushes panel, you'll see that blue outline, and the brush loads with the default brush settings for that brush. You can think of this as the brush preset, so all of the preset options. Now, when you come over here and you draw with that brush, it's going to draw with whatever those settings are. But as soon as you start to make changes over here, so let me adjust the size, and immediately we see this turn to red. So I might come in here and make some other changes as well, so I can lower this down, whatever I want to do. Now suddenly I'm working with a different brush. This red outline lets you know this is the selected brush, but changes have been made from the default settings. And then you have a couple options because you can update that brush and change the default settings. You can create a new brush based on the stuff you have here, the new setting changes you've made. But if I were to suddenly switch off this brush, so let's say I like these current settings, but I don't do anything at all, and I just switch off to another brush, then as soon as I come back to that brush I was using, it's back to those default settings. So the order of operations and how you manage your brushes is important because you can come in here and you can easily lose settings of a brush you like, or you might accidentally make changes to the default settings when you didn't mean to. So let's look at this and really understand of how we want to manage this. So if I were to come in here and right click this blue selected brush that has the preset values here, I would see these options here. Now the ones I'm concerned with right now are this edit brush option and then also update and reset brush. And we can see that update and reset are grayed out currently because we have not made any changes to the brush. However, if I come in here and edit the brush, we are directly immediately updating this brush preset. So we are going to overwrite and lose any settings we had before. So if I come in here and up the size to 104, then we'll notice it stays blue. There's no option in here to reset. I've immediately applied the changes. So you have to keep in mind, if you come in here and you right click and edit a brush, or if you double click to get into that brush, then we'll notice the brush is coming up and we can see the brush name. And this is different from editing a brush using this more. You're going to get the same menu here, but it's different from using more because we are permanently immediately updating the brush preset. If I were instead to be using this brush and use this more thing here, I get the same menu, but we notice we don't see the brush name here. And then I could come in here and I could set this to 64, making the other adjustments I want. We'll see it turn red over here. And then I could come back over here and I could immediately come in here and I could update the brush with the new settings. So when you're working with a brush by using this More tab, you're temporarily coming in to adjust settings. You haven't committed them to the brush preset yet. However, if you're double clicking over here or right clicking and choosing the edit brush over here, you're immediately coming in here and you're immediately making changes to that preset. And that's a very important distinction. It also means when you're coming over here and you're using this More tab and the sliders up here, you're making temporary changes to the way the brush works. But if you want to save that, if you want to preserve that, you're going to have to save it in some way. Because if you leave this tool and then come back to the tool, then suddenly it's going to have the default preset settings again. The other thing that I want to show you here is that there's a reset button up here in the menu here, but it works a little different from the reset button down here, which doesn't really make intuitive sense, but I want you to know that that is how it's set up. Either way, what I do when I do this, it's going to reset to what the last default loaded brush settings were. So if I hit reset, we're going to lose that softness. It's going to go back to that. But we'll notice over here, we lost that blue selection. The brush, in fact, is totally deselected, so I could come up here and come up with all sorts of different settings, and I couldn't directly come over here right now and click on the brush to update it because I'm not actually using that brush. Now I could come under the More tab here and I could save as to create a whole new brush. I could reset this to the standard default values that come with this More menu, but again, I'm not working specifically on a brush preset over here. So this reset button here loads the last loaded preset, but it also deselects the brush over here. In contrast, if I were to come in here and again make some changes, so lower down the size, lower down the flow, and create a new brush like this, then if I were to come directly over here and right click on the brush, then I could suddenly reset the brush. So again, we go back to those default settings, but this stays as a selected brush. So just a slight difference. But I think the bottom line is my recommended workflow is once you have a brush that you love, that you like, that you sometimes want to use, then you want to make sure you protect that. So you do need to be careful about directly double clicking or directly right clicking and choosing the edit option, because then you're going to be updating that preset. So if you double click and get in there, a good option is to immediately go save as. Or you load something on screen and then immediately you come up here and you choose save as, because then I could go in here, I could call this new brush, and then suddenly I'm creating a new brush. So now when I come in here and make changes, I know that I'm working with this new brush. We can see this is now the selected brush. So now when I come in here and I make updates to this brush, then we can come in here, we can make all the changes we want, and we get it the way we like it. Then you want to make sure you right click on that brush and you want to update the brush so that it's capturing these settings, okay? So you can fool around and get it the way you actually like it and then choose save as, or you can have it selected here and then choose update, but you want to make sure you commit those changes. And you also want to make sure you're not directly editing a preset that you love, because you might not want to overwrite and lose that. So those are the two things. Make sure you protect those brushes you love, and then make sure when you come up with new settings that you love, you write those to a new brush, because both of those things can save you some lost time and some headaches. And then once you create a new brush, it's very easy to manage where that brush is stored, because you can come over here, you can right click on that brush, and you can come here and you can copy to a category, or you can move it to a category. So let's go ahead and move this one to brush testing. So I'll go ahead and put it in that category now. So now if I come into this brush category, brush testing, which is up here, right there, I can see that at the bottom of this, now I have this new brush. Now you can also create new categories just by coming to the brush menu itself. To the top, this triangle up here, I can come in here, I can delete categories, duplicate categories, rename categories, or create a new category. So let's just call this category 2, and we'll just call it new brush category. And obviously I would do something that makes a little bit more sense, but that makes sense for this video here since we're learning how to do these sorts of things. So now we have this new brush category. We can see there are no brushes in here as of yet, but if I go back to that brush testing, we go to the bottom, here's this new brush. Maybe I just want to make a copy of it. So let's copy to category, and we'll put it in that new brush category. And now if I go over there, I have this new brush category and it has a brush in it. So it's very easy to manage your brushes like this. And one trick I like to use is if I'm working on a current project or just in a certain mode, maybe I'll create a current brushes category, and then I can create copies of brushes and put that in that current brushes category. So they may still exist in inking or pencil marks or whatever category makes sense, but now I have this new category where I can easily find the current brushes that I'm using most often on whatever sorts of projects I'm working on. The final paintbrush tool option we have up here in this contextual bar are these symmetry settings. So if I click on this now, suddenly I can turn on symmetry. And when you turn on symmetry, it's going to allow you to create symmetrical brush strokes, and the number of strokes you create is going to be determined by how many symmetry lines you set up here. So the lowest you can go is 1, so I'll just start with 1 by default. And then I have this sort of square on screen where if I click right on that, I can move that around and set the origin point to wherever I want. So I'm going to set it roughly to the center of my screen. And then if I were to hover right over the line until I see this rotation icon, I could click and I could rotate like this. I'm just going to hold down my shift key as I rotate, because then it'll do constrained proportions or constrained rotation, so like 15 degrees. So I'm just going to set it back to a straight line across there. But so you have that, and once you have it set up the way you want it, it's a good idea to turn on this lock. That's going to lock your symmetry line. And you leave it locked until you want to make more adjustments, because otherwise when you draw strokes, you could accidentally mess that up. Okay, so with just one symmetry line set, let me come up here, and when I see these 2 dots, we can see I'm going to be making 2 brush strokes. So when I bring these together, that's going to show me where that origin point is. And then when I start to draw out a line, we'll see that another line gets drawn in the opposite quadrant. So when I draw something in the upper right, it's going to draw something in that lower left. When I draw in the upper left, it's going to draw something in that lower right. So that's how this works. Now with one line, if I went in here and I turned on this mirror, I could have it now so it's just mirroring across this horizontal line. So now if I draw something here, it's drawing something on the opposite part of that line, the opposite side of that line. Now let me just hit Control A to select everything. And then delete to delete, just so we can have a clear screen to work with. Now let's come back up to the symmetry settings, and let's go ahead, we'll turn off mirroring, and we'll turn on up the number of lines. So now we can see we have more and more. Let's just set it to 4. And now when I come in here and I draw, suddenly now, because we have all of these symmetry lines, we're going to be putting down even more points. So I'll come in here and I'll draw something, and we can see how we can create these really cool patterns really easily by making use of this symmetry option. So maybe I'll click something here, and then I'll shift click. Whenever you shift click, you're just drawing from wherever your last stroke ended, a straight line to that new point where you touch your pen or you touch your mouse, click your mouse. So again, that's a shift click. So if I were to click here and then shift click up here, and then I could shift click over here and then shift click down here. So very easily using that shift click trick, we can put down strokes in straight lines and come up with these really cool patterns. And then of course that first demo was just with a simple black brush. You can come up with complicated brush effects in here and really quickly get some pretty amazing results. So you can do some really cool stuff with these symmetry options. Okay, so we've covered all the brush options in this contextual bar up here, but we still have this whole more category to discuss. The good news is a lot of what's in this more menu is going to build upon what we already learned. And the other thing is, I know we're putting some time into learning this, but that time is going to pay you back tenfold in terms of the time you're going to save and the extra levels of creativity you're going to have by really learning this brush engine. We're going to start to dive into all the additional settings you get under this More menu. But before we do, there's something important that we haven't even discussed yet, and that's that there are actually two distinct types of brushes you can create here in Affinity. And I'm not just talking about the brush settings, I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about intensity brushes versus image brushes, because there are two types of brush heads we can start with here in Affinity. And depending on which one we start with, we're going to have some things behave a little differently in here. So we're going to start with that, we're going to learn that, and then we're going to see how we can use all these settings to customize those brushes once we have it here in Affinity. So I have a new brush category which I've created here. Let's go ahead and create some brushes. So to create a brush, you just come up here to this triangle, the brush menu here, and we're going to come down and we're going to find this section here where we can create these new brushes. Now, I mentioned two main kinds of brushes, the image brush and the intensity brush, so we see those options, but we also have new round brush, new square brush, and then new brush from selection, so we're going to look at all these. Let's just start by creating a new round brush. So in a new round brush, we have this brush here, and then when I go and paint with this brush, it paints just like we expect it to, and we have all the options up here that we've already discussed. And of course, we can come down here, and we haven't really discussed color so far, but anytime you come in here and you change this foreground color to something else, then we're painting with a new color. Okay, so everything as we expect. Now, if I were to come under that same menu, and instead of that round brush, I choose a square brush. Now, same thing. Things are acting like I expect. I can come in here, I can change the color. I can come up here, I can change the size. Let's make it a little bit bigger. I can lower the opacity. So all the things we're used to. However, you'll notice that if I look at the hardness is grayed out, and I don't have the ability to change that. Now the reason why that is a little technical. When you create a round brush here, it's actually working off a procedural equation to determine the softness of that brush. With the square, it's just putting down like a pixel stamp. It's not working quite the same way, so there is that slight difference. And if you want hardness and to be able to adjust it right there, you're going to have to start out with this round brush. The square brush is not going to do that. Now we're going to talk about how that comes into play with image brushes and intensity brushes as well. So let's start to look at this with a few examples. So I have 4 objects on screen now. I have a soft circle, a hard circle, a rectangle with 2 colors, and then this goofy cutout image of myself. And so I'm going to start by turning these into brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and select this circle here, and then we'll go up here, and another option you have with brushes is you can come under this brush menu and you can choose new brush from selection. So whatever layer you're on, you select pixels, and then you do new brush from selection, and now it's turned that into a brush. Now, notice it says image brush. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but let's go ahead and paint something with that brush. So I'll hit Control D to deselect. Let's just select that brush. Make sure I'm up on a separate layer. Make sure I have the brush tool selected. And so now we're ready to paint with that brush. And when I do, let's see what we get. So we just get this nice soft brush because we have this soft edge that we used when creating the brush. All right, I'll hit Control Z just to clear those last strokes. And then let's do the same thing now, but we'll do it with the next brush. So I'm actually going to real quick create brushes out of these other 3 objects that we haven't done yet. So let me just hit Control. This is the one with the hard circle here. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing where I come in here, new brush from selection. Let's go to the next one here. So this rectangle, again, new brush from selection. And then let's finally go to this cutout image here. And again, we'll go new brush from selection. There we go. So now we have all these brushes that we've created. Notice they all say image brush. Now let me hit deselect and let's go ahead and turn these layers off just so we can see a little bit better. And then we have a blank pixel layer up top. So again, reminder of that first brush here. When we come in here, there's that first brush. Here's that second hard rectangle that we created with right there. And then the next thing here, this one with the 2 colors, the rectangle. So if I draw across there, obviously we have that spacing going on. And then finally the image brush here. Let's again load this up and boom, draw across the screen. So when you create a brush from a selection, it is creating an image brush. There is something called an image brush and there is something called an intensity brush. When you choose this new brush from selection option, you end up getting an image brush. And we can see this where these all say image brushes. But we have other clues as well. So with each of these, if I go to any of these brushes here, so if I click through to any of these brushes up under settings, we're going to notice that the softness is grayed out. So whether a brush is soft or hard, it's built into how you create the brush itself. This brush has a soft edge up here because that's how we created it. We created this very soft circle, and then that's what we brought in. So when you create an image brush, it is stamping the exact pixels that you define with your selection. It is making that your brush head, and it's going to create an exact stamp of that. Now, when I say an exact stamp, you will not be able to change the brush color. So if I come into any of these brushes, so this brush here, then suddenly if I go up here and I draw on screen, I have to load a color, so let's have it as black. But if I were to come in here and change this color here, no matter what I change my color to, it is not going to change the color of that brush. It's always going to put it down in black because it's stamping the exact pixel. So you can change the color all you want in here. When you paint with it, it's not going to change the color. So that's one thing to know. And the hardness, of course, is built in because you're defining that with the stamp that you create. You can't adjust it in here. When you have a round brush like we looked at before, then it's using the math behind the scenes, and yeah, it can do softness, it can increase it, it can decrease it, but not when you have an image brush. Does that make image brushes less cool? Not at all. They're just different, and you have to understand those differences. So I'm going to select this brush here, and again, for a reminder here, let's get the brush tool loaded up, and we'll see what that does. But let's come in here and let's adjust these settings. So you can't do hardness, but you can still do all the other brush settings. So let's start by just taking the spacing on this brush all the way down. So let's take it all the way down. And so now when we paint a stroke here, we get this blue, and of course we're just seeing the red at the very edge there. Well, that's if we go in one direction. What if I were to come up here and do something like this? Then suddenly we have a very cool brush where we're sort of creating this ribbon style look, going back and forth. Again, I could try to be smooth with this. I could try to paint really smooth, something really smooth, and go back and forth. And so we're getting this flowing ribbon with two colors in here. We have blue on one side, we have red on the other side. You could not get two colors like this just using an intensity brush. Because when we look at intensity brushes next, or when we looked at how we created a circle brush before, with an intensity style brush, you are creating one color, and then you might have variable transparency in there where some of the color is only partially showing through. But you can't have two colors in one brush. With something like this, with an image brush, you may not be able to change the color, but you can build as many colors as you want. You could even do something silly like this, where you had a brush like this, where you're actually stamping out something on the screen. Now, I don't know why you would use this particular stamp, but you could do something like this. So you have this whole nother set of options with image brushes. And then once you actually understand all the things you can do in Affinity, the color thing isn't necessarily as big of a limitation. Sure, you could set up a particular color of a brush because that's what you wanted to do on that project, but you also could come in here and take advantage of adjustment layers. So I have something in here, it's blue and red now, but maybe I want it to be a different color. I could just come down here, pull up this HSL, hue, saturation, luminance adjustment layer, and I could come in here and hey, I could change the color after the fact to whatever I want. I can mask the changes to just that layer if I have other things in my project. So it's not necessarily as big as a limitation as you think. So image brushes, you're going to have that hard edge or soft edge, that hardness defined built into your brush ahead of time, because it's just going to be the stamp of whatever you're going to be creating as your brush head. But then you can put multiple colors in there, and then you can, after the fact, adjust that with something like a hue saturation layer. Now with those last examples, we came up here and we chose new brush from selection, and we saw we ended up with image brushes. If we had come up here and chosen this new image brush command, then we're going to choose a file from our computer and we're going to load it that way, but functionally we're going to end up with the same thing. Once again, we're getting an image brush. So it doesn't matter which of these methods you use. If you're using something that you have open on screen and you want to load it as a selection and then create the brush this way, that's fine. If you use this new image brush because it's a file you have stored, you're going to end up with the same thing. But there is another option in here, new intensity brush. So with new intensity brush, it's going to be something you can't create from a selection. You have to load it as a file. So I'm going to load these same 4 files we just used, except this time we're going to be creating them as intensity brushes, and we'll see what that means. So I'm going to go ahead and load these now. I won't make you watch me do it, but I'll go ahead and do this first one here. So go ahead and open it, and we see it shows up as a new brush. Now let me do the other 3 real quick, and then we'll get back to this. Okay, so I have these new 4 brushes now, which we've just created as intensity brushes, and with all of them, if I click on any one of them here, we can see that I do not have that softness option. So again, with an intensity brush like this, the softness is built in, which we're going to see in a minute. It's part of the creation process. It's not going to be something you can change after the fact, and we'll understand why in a minute once we see exactly how intensity brushes work. So let's investigate this. If we click on any of these now, we get a nice soft stroke with this one because it has that soft edge. And again, I have black as my foreground color. The other one here, again, clicking and dragging, we have that hard edge. So far, this is what we expect. This is what we saw before with our image brush. But then if I come to this cutout here, then suddenly I notice that this is black as well. And remember before with this one, we were getting the actual pixel data that we saved and loaded as a selection, loaded as an image brush. It was maintaining that color information. Now we're just getting whatever color we have chosen here. Same thing if I choose this color rectangle, I click and drag this one. And if we zoom in on this one, let me make the brush even bigger, we'll notice that I'm really just seeing almost the same shade there. If I click that, there's not much of a difference here. We can see that more dramatically, I think. Let me just hit Control A and then delete to delete what I have on screen there. And let me grab this brush again, but watch what happens now when I change the color. Suddenly I can paint with a different color. So the same with these other ones here. Before we couldn't change the color value. Now we'll see that all of these, you can come in here and you can change the color. So suddenly with intensity brushes, you have the ability to update the color. Now let me go back to this rectangle before. Remember, this was our 2-toned rectangle. So I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to adjust down the spacing like we did before. Remember, we had one side that was blue and one side that was red, and we could see that dramatic difference with it as an image brush. But now if I come in here and let's lower down the spacing like we did before, and I'll come in here and I'll make another curved stroke like that, it's looking all the same. Now, why is that? Well, when I created that brush, I came up here and I chose 2 different colors, 2 different hues on this ring, but essentially I chose the same brightness value. So I'm not seeing a difference here because when we create an intensity brush, it's all about the brightness values, and you have to train yourself to think in a grayscale. If we look at this color wheel up here, there are different ways where you can come in here and show this. So you can come up here and you could see sliders instead. You could see something different down below, but I like to use this wheel, and then I like to use this triangle here. So what are we seeing on this? Well, on the outer ring here, these are the color hues. And then once we get inside here, we're talking about saturation as we go from one side of this scale to the next. So the colors become more and more saturated as we move to this gray. You're talking about the purest form of the color if we're talking about the hue that's on the ring. But then essentially we're adding black and white to this. So how much black and white are we mixing with that color? This is all still essentially that color. We're just seeing different versions of how bright the color is and different versions of how saturated the color is. That's why you hear HSL slider, you have the hue of the color. You have the saturation level of the color, how pure is it? And then as you start to add black and white, it's becoming less pure, less saturated. And then also as you add that black, it's getting darker, right? Darker in tone here. So that would be the luminance value, that's the L. So HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about the different colors we can create here. And so brightness, since these were the same brightness value, even though we had two distinct hues with the creation of this brush, it doesn't matter because when you create intensity brushes, it's just looking at the brightness values. And we can best show that with an example so we really understand what's happening when you create a new intensity brush. Okay, we're going to start totally from scratch and create a brush, an intensity brush, just so we fully understand this. And I'm using this hard edge brush to build this out. So this is what you'll do a lot of times. You'll use another brush and use that to build the base stamp, the image you're going to use for your new image brush or your new intensity brush in this case. And so what I'm doing now is I'm starting with white here, and I have a transparent background just so we can see what's going on. And I will start by putting a white circle on this side here, and then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to drag this all the way up to pure black. Let's put black on the other side. In the middle here, I'll go and grab like a middle gray, and I'll put the middle gray here. And then let's do something in between. So here's something sort of in between middle gray and black, so we'll put one right there. And then we'll come over here and we'll come down and we'll put something in between white and this one here, and we're going to go ahead and put that on screen there. Now you can have text or whatever you want in here in the actual shape, and then you're just going to convert it into some grayscale image. And if you didn't have grayscale, it's going to automatically do that, which we saw with the last example. Even though we had red and blue, that did not matter. It was looking at the brightness values. So let me just come in here and grab this text tool here. So I'm just going to put some artistic text on here. It's not going to matter because we're going to save this off as a PNG. So I'm going to just put a W here, so W for white, and the text I'm going to make all black, and we'll see why I do that in a minute, because I want to be able to see this after the fact. So we're going to come up here and we'll just change that text to all black. And so this is W. This is we're going to put that above the white square. Then I will just copy this. So let me just Alt and drag out a couple copies. So we'll put this one on this different side. I'll just put a B for black there, and then I'll go ahead and create one more copy. And let's just come in here and drag this here. And I'm just going to put M to indicate that this is like a middle gray. So like almost like 50% gray, halfway between white and black. So that is good here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to take all of this here, and I'll take everything, and we're going to go ahead and merge selected just to put it on one layer here. And then I'm just going to hit Control click on a Windows. That would be Command click on Mac, just to select it all. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this off as a PNG file. So I'm going to go up here and go File, and we're going to go Export, and we're going to export this, and I'll bring that up on screen just so we can see it here. And let's just go ahead and export this, and same folder, and I will just call this brush. Let's call it Intensity Brush Test. Intensity Brush Test, because we're going to turn this into an intensity brush. Okay, I'll hit Control D to deselect. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Now we're going to load that as a brush. So we're going to do this by coming to the brush menu like we've been doing, new intensity brush, and here's that intensity brush test. And I'm going to go ahead and open that. And so now here it is as a stamp. So right here, let me make sure I have my brush selected so I can see it. There it is. I can make it bigger, so I can still use that bracket keyboard shortcut to make it bigger. Now, if I click now, let me load some paint. So let's go ahead and D for default colors. We'll do X to flip the foreground and the background colors. I have this turned off, so let's make sure I have a layer where I can actually paint on. So there we go. Now we see it, and now I click on it. You'll notice when I stamp with this brush, I am not seeing anything for the white there. And we could put a different color background behind this if we wanted to. So I could come down here. Let's do a new one here. Let's choose some sort of red or something. Some kind of color where we're going to be able to see through. Actually, I'll just choose a pink here. And so we could fill the background if we wanted to have a color behind this. So there we go. So we can see that it's showing through here. So these levels here towards the bottom have some sort of transparency, where over here I'm seeing pure black. Now maybe we're seeing that better without a background color at all. So here again, we can see that you can see that transparent background is showing through. You can see that checkered pattern on the middle gray and on this lower gray, and then the one that was white, we're not seeing anything at all. Now you'll notice also I changed my color to pink, so now if I stamp again, I'm seeing a pink color, but again, it gets more and more transparent as we move to the white sides of things. And that is that's what's happening when you create an intensity brush. It is using that brightness scale to determine how much paint it is putting down. Just like if you are familiar with masks in a program like Affinity, something that is pure white on a mask is going to show through completely, because essentially the mask is not affecting anything at all. If it's pure black, you're not going to see anything, because then the mask is in full effect and it is blocking anything from showing through. So that's sort of, you have to think in reverse about that. But again, the brightness values are controlling what shows through. We can still choose any color, so any color we want to, but when we choose a color and we stamp it down, that brush is being affected by the brightness values. So if I were to go ahead and stamp over this again, right over top, we'll see that those colors slowly build up. So the more I stamp here, the more I stamp, we'll see that slowly those colors all move to that same blue because they are building up, okay? but it is the brightness values that matter when you create an intensity brush. So something that's pure black is going to show completely. It's going to be totally opaque. You're not going to see any layers behind it. If something is a middle gray, then suddenly you do have some transparency there, 50% transparency, and you can see through to the layer below it. If something is very close to white, then you're just putting down a little bit of paint, and you'll have to click several stamps, have several stamps overlapping, and that color will slowly start to build up until you reach the purest form of that color, which of course then is totally opaque and you can't see through it. But again, all these brushes here, intensity brushes, just make use of one color. You're painting with one color at a time. You may have varying levels of transparency because of that white to black brightness scale, but you are working with one color. So the takeaway here is that when you create intensity brushes, you're creating brushes that are going to work with one color at a time, but the different levels of transparency that you can have within that one brush head stamp are all going to be determined by the brightness values from white to black in that image you use as your base stamp. That's going to become the base stamp for your brush. As we get into discussing the more settings here we have for our brush, we'll see that a lot of these we've covered already, and they actually just have the same exact controls that we have up here. We're just now accessing them within this more window. So size, if I do it here, we can see that it's also updating down up there. And the same thing if we fool around with flow, it's also just affecting it up here. Hardness, if this was a brush where we could change the hardness, so we know we can't do that with image or intensity brushes, but only with those round brushes we can create in here. And if we did that here, we'd see that same setting update here in the contextual menu. And the same is true when we come down the blend mode. So if I change the blend mode here to multiply, we'll see it change up here. I can also change it up here, and it's going to change in here. So a number of these settings, again, they're just mirrored in both places. Also wet edges, so if I turn wet edges on, we'll see that button gets highlighted up here. So a number of these settings, just keep in mind that they exist both up here and both in this more box. Doesn't matter where you change it, it's going to do the same thing. The accumulation setting here is very similar to the opacity setting. They both have to do with how much paint you're putting down, and they both work at that stroke level. Now at first glance, these may look exactly the same. So I have 100% here set for my opacity and also for my flow. And so let's take the accumulation and let's set that down to 50%. So accumulation set to 50, these other ones I'm keeping at 100%. So I'll draw, and we see that as I'm doing one stroke here, there's no buildup at the stamp level, it's happening at the stroke level. And so then if I do another stroke and I have some overlap, we see that's where we start to get that paint build up. Now let me flip my settings. I'm going to take accumulation all the way back up to 100, and let's come into opacity, and we'll set the opacity to 50%. So I've just flipped those settings. So now again on screen, I'm going to draw and see same thing at the stroke level. We're not getting any buildup, but then when I do a new stroke and we have the overlap, it looks like these are working exactly identical. However, these are slightly different settings, because when you start to lower your flow and you're mixing flow and opacity or flow accumulation, then there is some slightly different math behind the scenes that's going to give you slightly different results. Let's just look at an example of that. So I'm going to come in here now. Let's take the flow and let's set it to something really low. So let's set the flow maybe down to 3%. So I'm going to set that at 3%, and then I'll leave it at 50% opacity here. For the moment, we'll leave accumulation at 100%, and we're going to go ahead and draw on screen here. This is all one stroke now, and now because of that flow setting, we're getting this buildup. So we're getting this buildup, but since we have that 50% opacity, it's really limiting it to not going past that 50% gray that we're seeing there. Now let's flip our settings here. Well, now let's take the accumulation down to 50. We'll leave our flow setting right at 3%, but we're going to bring the opacity up to 100%. So we've really just flipped those two settings. Now I'm going to draw on screen, and as we draw out here, we see that a lot more quickly we're getting this full buildup, this full accumulation here. So the accumulation, the math that's going on behind it, and the math that's going on with opacity here, there is a slightly different result that's happening when we start to mix flow settings and opacity settings, or flow settings and accumulation settings. I just want to keep you in mind, these tools are similar, these settings are similar, but they do give you slightly different results when you start mixing them in with different flow settings. The spacing setting is fairly obvious, and we should understand that now since we've discussed how brushes work by putting down those individual stamps. And so if we drag this up, we can increase the spacing. If we drag it down, we're bringing those stamps very close together. So we can draw a nice smooth continuous stroke like this by bringing the spacing close together. But then of course, as we start to drag out the spacing, we can increase the distance between the stamps. So that is the spacing setting here in Affinity. The shape setting is something that you'll notice is often going to be grayed out because when you create your own custom intensity or image brushes, they are not going to have this shape option. We'll notice that it's grayed out. I can't come in here and change the shape. Now that's going to be true even if I come under this file menu and I create this new square brush, because we'll remember with this particular brush here, remember this is an image brush, so once again that shape is not an option. The only time it is going to be an option is if you're using a round brush. Now remember, a round brush, not one we've created where we did a round selection. This has to be one where specifically you're creating it as a new round brush, or a lot of the default brushes come built based on a round brush. Because remember, when we go up here and we go new round brush, this is the one brush where that procedural math is going to come into play, where it's doing an equation to create the size of the brush or to create the hardness. So if we look down here and we look at this now, we see we have hardness as an option, but we also have spacing, we also have shape as an option. And so if I were to just increase the spacing so we can see what's going on at the individual stamp level, because again, rotation is going to be something that affects that individual stamp. Pretty much all these settings affecting the individual stamp. So when we do this rotation here, when we do the shape here, we can see we can take that circle and we can start to squash it down. So now suddenly we can get a totally different brush shape. Or if we want to go full circle, we can also go full circle. Drag it all the way down so it's barely just a thin line. We can do that as well. So when you're using that procedural round brush, you can squash the shape using this shape slider. The rotation brush probably does exactly what you expect it to. It's doing a rotation of that brush stamp at that brush stamp level. So you might have it set to the normal as you create it, but then if you want to come in here and you want to change it up, you can change it up. Now, as you increase or decrease the spacing, that's going to have an effect as well, because now suddenly that spacing is coming into play as you drag and create your brush stroke. So for example here, I could take this rotation and let's put it to something like this. And now when I do a brush stroke across the screen, we get this nice thick line. But if I go up the screen, then suddenly that's a much thinner line. So if you wanted to do something like a calligraphy brush like this, where you want it to be thicker one way than the other way, that's where you might want to pay attention to the brush rotation to make sure that brush head is oriented so you're going to get the effect you're looking for. So obviously with the circle brush, rotation is not really going to matter, but when you have a brush like this where it's much wider than it is tall or vice versa, then suddenly this rotation setting is really going to come into play and really affect how your brush stroke looks depending on what angle you're working at. Well, let me hit Control A and delete just so we have a clean workspace here. And then I also want to show you that as you're dragging out here, so if I had a brush set like this, then I could create a straight line if I went up this way. However, if I wanted to sort of on the fly change my rotation of my brush, so I could sort of create a straight line this way, create a straight line this way, or something where the brush is thinner or thicker, whatever I want. That's where you can use the arrow keys. So right now you see the brush moving. I am just using the right or left arrow keys on my computer. So that's a very helpful keyboard shortcut to know when you're working with your brushes, is you can use that right or left arrow keys just to on the fly as you're painting, go in there and change the rotation of your brush, because when you have a brush that's wider than it is thicker, you can get vastly different results. And so if you wanted to do something where you're painting a thicker stroke going down this way, you'd set it that way. If you want that thicker stroke to go down the other way, you rotate the brush, go down that way. So rotation, very cool setting. And sometimes you can get these interesting results and you just have to play around to see, you might want something where you have these variable width strokes depending on what direction you're painting on the screen. This associated tool dropdown lets you define whether you want the current brush to be available to use with all the different tools in Affinity that use brushes, or just one specific tool. So by default, it has no associated tool, but we also remember we have the eraser tool that uses brushes, and then all these other brush tools as well. So no associated tool. That is what by default what I would leave it set as, although I'll talk about instances where you might want to change it. So if we draw out on screen now, we can obviously brush with that tool, but then let's say I wanted to switch over to my eraser tool, and as we do, we see it jump to a different brush because it's using a different brush. Well, maybe I wanted to use the same brush. So now if I come back to that same brush, now I'm brushing with that brush that I just drew with. Now, if you jump back and forth between the eraser and the brush tool using your B keyboard shortcut to get to a brush and then E to get back to your eraser, if you have those set to the same brushes, very easily you can brush and then erase with the same brush, which sometimes can give really pleasing results. So that's where this no associated tool is helpful, because because then you can use the same brush across multiple tools. Now, when might you want it to just have a specific tool here? Well, let's say I wanted the brush to always be an eraser brush. I wanted to be able to choose it over here and have it automatically switch to becoming an eraser brush. That's when I could come in here and specifically define it. Now, maybe I want both versions, so I could come in here and save one version as no associated tool. Then if I clicked save as and defined a new brush, maybe gave it eraser as part of the name, and then I came in here and dropped this down to erase brush tool, and then we'll notice now if I do erase brush tool, let me just update it over here so it updates, and so now we see it has the little eraser icon there. And so now if I'm using a different brush, so let's come back up here, let's paint something on screen. I'm painting with a different brush, and then suddenly if I want to go and switch specifically to the eraser tool, you notice as soon as I click on this, it's automatically going to switch to the eraser tool. And if I try to use this tool and switch up to the brush tool, it's automatically going to switch back to something other than this. So this can only be an eraser now, and anytime I select this in the brush menu, it's just going to jump to that eraser tool. So if you were setting up a project and you want to have very specific brushes and you want to just click over here and have it jump to the tool you want, you might want to go ahead and define it specifically as a brush or eraser. So it could be helpful in certain instances to come in here and make use of this ability to define something to all tools or one specific tool. Before we move on to this Dynamics tab, now that we have a good feel of all these general settings, let's circle back to the paintbrush tool, and some of the keyboard shortcuts that I mentioned before were a little tricky just reading this dialog here, but they can be really useful. So let's circle back and talk about these now. Now the first one is just the shift trick, which I've mentioned. So if you click and put down a point anywhere, if you then hold down shift, it's going to draw a straight line when you put down your next point. So from wherever I landed the last point, I hold down shift, put down a new point, hold down shift, put down a new point. So that can be really helpful. That's just holding down shift before you start your next brush stroke, which if you're using a mouse, it might just be a click. If you're using a stylus, you might tap the screen. The next one is a little trickier, but it is super helpful, and that is being able to pull up your color picker on the fly. So this involves holding down the Alt key if you're on Windows, Option if you're on Mac, and you want to do that first, and then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to touch the screen and start your stroke either with your mouse or with your stylus. So it's an Alt plus a drag, so Alt, and then I click my left mouse button and then I start the drag, and then we'll see how it brings up that color picker. So if I wanted to choose any color of the sky, I could switch. So again, hold down Alt, then click and start that drag. It brings up the stylus instead of putting down paint. Click the Alt key, hold down that left mouse button, start to drag, pick up any color. So I'm picking up colors from my canvas here, even though they're not on the current layer I'm working on. So this is very helpful because you might stamp down a color palette, something like this on your screen represents the colors you want to use, and you can get those to those very quickly just using this keyboard shortcut. And you can do this, regardless of any brush you're working on here. So if I just create a new layer here, let's turn this off. Let's say these are colors I wanted to use with my cloud brush just to add in some different colors to the highlights and shadows. So I could be working on that layer, I could be working with this cloud brush over here, and then all I would have to do is on the fly come over here. Let's say I want to add some shadow area, so I'm going to come over here, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, left click, grab this color, and then I'll start painting a little bit up here just to bring in a little bit of that shadow color up here. And then I want to switch over to highlights, same thing, hold down Alt, hold down the left mouse button, grab the highlight color down here, and then start to paint in some of that highlight color on the other side of my cloud. So again, it takes a little practice because you got to hold down that Alt or Option key, and then you have to actually start your stroke on screen, which if you're using a mouse, that involves clicking down that left mouse button. So it's a little tricky, but once you get the hang of this, super helpful. Now the final trick in here is even a little bit more complicated because if we hover over this again, we'll see that it involves holding down Control Alt and clicking at the same time. Now if you ever forget those keys, you can just come hover over the tool itself and get this little tool tip to remember what keys you need to use. Now let me demonstrate this. So if I come down here now and I switch to this round brush up here, just so we're going to be able to see everything. And one thing I haven't mentioned before, if you ever want to reorder a brush in a category, you can just take it, you can just drag it wherever you want, release your mouse button, drop it. So drag and drop functionality over here. Now with this round brush, I'm going to use that trick where I hold down Control and I hold down Alt. Now on a Mac, that would be Command plus the Option key. Here on Windows, it's Control plus Alt. Since I'm working with my mouse, I'm doing Control Alt, and then I'm going to do a left mouse click. That would be touching your stylus if you were working with a stylus. But working with a stylus, sometimes they have keyboard modifiers and little hotkeys that you can use, so you might not even need this on a stylus. But here on Windows with a mouse, this could be helpful. So Control and then Alt, and you'll see once you do that, you'll see a category show on screen. And then if you just click your mouse button while you have Control and Alt held down. So once you start this, you're basically keeping Control and Alt held down the whole time, and then you're just using your mouse to cycle through categories. So my mouse will cycle through categories. So when I have it set to rotation right here, this is obviously a round brush, but if I were to hold down my left keyboard shortcut, if I were to hold down my left mouse button and rotate right or left, drag my mouse right or left, I can see that it changes the rotation of that brush. Now, let me make the brush even bigger so we can see this more easily. So how would I do that? Control Alt, let's click until we find the width and hardness. And now there's two options here. So if I click and hold the left mouse button and go left and right, then I can use that to make my brush bigger. If suddenly I were to drag up and down, then that's affecting hardness. So whenever you see two categories like this, if you go up and down, you're going to control one. If you go left and right, you're going to control the other. So very easily, we can come in here now, Control Alt, click through the different categories. Here's the one that's shape and spacings. I'll hold down my left mouse button. I can do the spacing one way. If I drag the other way, then I'm doing the shape. So just really easily on the fly, you can now come and you can really cycle through all of these general settings. It doesn't have flow on here, but it's very helpful just to change the shape, the size, the hardness, the spacing of your brush. You can do it all on the fly if you memorize this keyboard shortcut. So again, that's holding down the Control and the Alt key. That'll get you in the mode. You use the left mouse button just to cycle through the categories. And then when you hold down the left mouse button and you drag it right and left or up and down, then you're actually going to be changing the settings. Now, obviously, it's going to work a little different on the stylus because you'll be touching the screen with your stylus instead of doing that left click with your mouse button. Either way, super helpful if you can master this little keyboard shortcut, mouse shortcut. It takes a little practice, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that hard and it can save you a lot of time. As we move from the General tab to the Dynamics tab, now things get really interesting because now we start to introduce the ability to introduce variability at the individual stamp level across all these different categories. So we have the ability to vary or jitter the size at the stamp level, and then we also have this percentage slider, which I'm going to talk about, and then also a drop-down slider where suddenly that's where some of the pressure sensitive settings that I mentioned, and having things like a Wacom tablet or some sort of pen tool where you're painting and using a pressure device, that's going to come into play. So let's look at this size jitter first. So I can drag up this size jitter here, and now we see it was set to none, but as soon as I start to drag this switches to random here. And then we have a slider which can go from 0 to 100. Now also of note here, notice I have the spacing set under this General tab, so I have over 100% spacing. So there's a space between each individual stamp, and that's going to come into play as well. So back under this size jitter setting here, as I drag this up here, we're changing the amount we can vary the size, the variability sort of range. So at 100%, basically something that goes from 100% of the current size to as small as you can get here. So as we drag out a stroke here, we can see we get these very small stamps, and then we also get these very large stamps. Now, if I wanted to jitter the size, but not nearly quite so much, if I took this all the way down to, let's say, 10%, now it's only letting me work within that 10% range. So something's going to be 100% sort of down through 90% of the current size. So as I do this slightly, we'll see we get this slight variability in size, but not nearly as pronounced as if I took this up to a higher range. Now suddenly we have this higher range. Putting it 100% most extreme to a brush size, it's basically as small as it gets to all the way up to full size. Now, I mentioned that we have the spacing set very wide, and that's going to be important because we see how much difference there is between the big brush stamps here and the small brush stamps. But what if I come back here and just drag the spacing all the way down? Now suddenly we get this slight jitter at the edge, but it doesn't look like we're varying the size nearly as much. Now, if you remember everything we've gone through, you can probably figure out why this is. It's because even though it's randomly picking a brush head size, remember, when the spacing is very small, lots and lots of stamps are going down in a small area. So even though there might be some small stamps varied within here, invariably we get one that's pretty large. And so it doesn't look like there's nearly as much variability here. However, we take the spacing slider and we start to drag it out. We see, yes, it's still there. We just have so many stamps in a small area when we have it down here, we're not seeing the full range. But if we drag it out, then suddenly we can see, okay, it really is using this full size range that we've defined here. Now, I also mentioned how important it is, this setting here. So this is just set to random. So if you're working with your mouse, it's just going to randomly put something down. But you do have a pressure sensitive option. If you choose this pressure sensitive option, then the jitter is actually becoming just a size variable that is defined by the amount of pressure you are applying with your pressure sensitive device. Let me hit Control A and delete just so we can clear the screen here, just so I can see what we're doing a little bit better, get rid of those other brush strokes. Now I'm going to switch over to my tablet instead of using my mouse. And so now we see if I start to apply a really low pressure stroke, very pushing down with really light pressure, they're pretty small, but if I start to apply more pressure and more pressure and more pressure, I can make it big. And then if I slowly let off my pen tool and lighter touch, lighter touch, lighter touch, I can make it small. So now on the fly, I can control whether I'm painting a thicker stroke or whether I'm painting a thinner stroke just by the amount of pressure I'm using with that pen tool. So that's why I say something like a Wacom tablet, if you really get into editing, if you get into art, digital art, then you're going to want some sort of pressure sensitive pen tool where you can really, really take fine control like this of some of these brush settings. I'm not going to cover every option in this drop down menu, but I want you to know some of these are ones you can use with both your mouse and a pen tool. Other ones you're only really going to be able to make use of with that pen tool. So if I look at, for example, let's come down and choose direction. If I had it set to direction, and so size now variable by direction, I could take my pen tool and as I draw in a circle, we can see okay, it's totally being defined, the size of the brush, by the direction I'm moving. Now I could use that same thing with my mouse, and again, going up with my mouse, dragging down with my mouse, it's also working. So with some of these, you're going to be able to do your mouse as well. It's just harder to have the same motor control, fine control with your mouse. So even though some of these settings work with your mouse, you are going to get better results if you have something like a pen tool. I'll hit Control A and delete just to clear my screen again. And then let's just show you one more here. So let me come under the menu and I will choose something that's only going to work with my pen tool. So let's come down here and choose something like tilt. So I can't really tilt my mouse back and forth, but with my pen tool now, if I have my pen straight up and down, I'm doing a small stroke, but then if I move it and tilt it to the side, then suddenly I'm getting a much thicker stroke. And if I were to sort of lay my pen on the side and sort of flick across the screen, flick across the screen, flick across the screen, flick across the screen, we see how we can control it sort of going from large to small there. So you can get some really interesting gestures and results in control when you have some of these settings set and you have something like a pressure sensitive pen tool. Now for me personally, the ones that make the most sense are setting size jitter to pressure, and then also a lot of times I will use size jitter with flow. So I'm controlling how much I put down the build up and then also the size with that pressure setting. So now if I draw very light, I'm getting that partial opacity, and then I can push down and get that full stroke, full size. But really just know that all of these can come in here and be adjusted based on those different pressure settings and those different settings in here. Now, one thing I'll mention, even if I were to turn these all the way off here, so I have nothing set here. So now by default, if I were to come in here and draw, everything's the same size, even when using my pen tool. But then if I were to come up here into this main menu, even though nothing is set in that menu here, I could turn on this force pressure button. So right here, we didn't talk about this before, but force pressure, that's gonna make it so size is always pressure dependent when using something like a pen tool. So with all these jitter settings, just remember that this slider is controlling the variability of range. So if you only do something slightly, then you're only introducing small variability, but if you drag it all the way up, then you're really increasing the variability a lot. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that if you're doing something like accumulation or flow, so let me just do the accumulation slider here, and then we'll draw a stroke across screen. But of course, if I do another stroke and we start to go back and forth, we see how we get that build up really quickly. Remember, you're just controlling the jitter setting here. You still have to worry about the universal setting. So because flow is set to 100%, this is going to build up very quickly as we go back over top of each other. So if I were to come in here and check flow and take it down a decent bit, then we could still have accumulation jitter, or we could still have flow jitter set here, and we are controlling how much it can jitter, but then remember that universal setting is still controlling the overall amount of flow that's going down. So you might have flow set to 100%, but then jitter could be set to something different. And the same thing, contrastingly, you can have flow set really low right here, and then you still are allowing it to vary within that range. So obviously, if I were to do a stroke like this, let's just do the flow jitter all the way up to 100, but let's set the flow here to 100, then we could have something really be completely on screen or partially opaque here. If I were to leave the flow jitter at 100%, but then take the flow way down, then we're really on the single stroke only going to have these very light marks. Some are going to be super, super light. Other ones are just going to be relatively light because we still are controlling that overall flow up here. It's just something to keep in mind as you work back and forth between your universal setting and then something like your jitter setting here. Hue jitter, saturation jitter, and luminosity jitter are pretty much self-explanatory, but just keep in mind if you're painting with a black brush and I were to use hue jitter, or if I were to come in here and use saturation jitter, I'm not going to see any change because by default here, when you're talking about white and you're talking about black, you're talking about something where there's no actual color value left in the brush. It is totally desaturated. Now with either of those, if I went in there and increased the luminosity jitter, yes, that's going to have an effect, but just keep in mind if you were going to come in here and use the hue jitter, the saturation jitter, then you would actually want to have at least some color in your brush here. So if I choose another color here and then I come under the luminosity jitter, that's still going to work. If I come in and then suddenly do some sort of saturation jitter, we're going to get more saturated colors versus less saturated. You see some are totally gray because I have it set to 100%, so some go to totally desaturated. Even if I have the color set all the way up because I have it set to 100%, we're getting everything from that pure color value all the way down to the desaturated grayscale value when we have that set to 100%. But if I were to make it something much less than that, then suddenly we'd be working with the pure color point as our starting point, and then it would become slightly desaturated with some of these, or I could up that a little bit and then we could see some of them become more and more desaturated as we drag this range higher and higher. Same thing with luminosity, playing with luminosity here. We're starting with something that's very bright, and then if I come in with the luminosity jitter, we can see some of these get a little darker, but then if I were to set this, actually let's turn this saturation off so I can see it a little bit better. We can see some of these getting a little darker, but then if I took this all the way up, we're going to see some of them now really go to extreme values all the way down to black. So luminosity, saturation, hue, pretty self-explanatory. Just understand when you're working with something that's already a grayscale value, the color's been completely taken out of it, then you're not necessarily going to see a change with that. You're going to want to have some sort of brush that has color to start with if you're talking about hue or saturation. The scatter X and the scatter Y settings are pretty self-explanatory. By default, when we draw a stroke here, it's putting down a stamp wherever our cursor is. So as we click once, it's going to put down a stamp exactly where the cursor is. If we click and hold, then as the cursor moves along, based on that spacing setting, every so often it's putting down a stamp right where the circle is. But if we come in here and start to mess with scatter X and scatter Y, now suddenly we're letting there be some variability in terms to where that image paintbrush stamp goes down in terms of the X and Y axis. So if I take this scatter X, we can see that as I move that, it's not necessarily going to put down a stroke exactly where I click my cursor. It might be a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. So there's variability on that right and left x-axis. Scatter Y, in contrast, that's going to be up and down. So now suddenly when I click something, it might put down a paint stroke above, below. So I have scatter X turned off, but if I just do scatter Y, now we can see that when I click once, it's going to be in line with that, but it's going to be up or down. When I click, it's going to put down a paint stamp either above or below, or it could be exactly by chance where I'm clicking. But again, these X and Y introduce that variability, and so now suddenly we can have a paintbrush that really sprays strokes all over the place because we're introducing this variability in terms of where the image stamp goes down. I'll hit Control A and then delete just to clear this for a second. And then once again, just keep in mind all this still goes back where these sort of settings are affected by one another. So if I bring the spacing in all the ways, I still have that variability, but now we see things are clustered more tightly because of that spacing setting. So let me make my brush even smaller here if I had a smaller brush now. So now we sort of have something where we're almost have one cohesive stroke, but let me just maybe come in and go back under that settings even more and we'll come and we'll sort of rein in our X and Y scatter a little bit. So maybe I want a brush that sort of has just a little bit more of this variable edge, but I still want it to look like one stroke. I could bring the spacing all the way in, but I could bring up this X and Y scatter a little bit. So you really can introduce a lot of interesting effects just by learning to combine these different brush settings. Flow we've already talked about a fair amount, so you can increase the flow jitter here, and that will obviously jitter that flow, but just remember that is tied to the overall setting here. So if you reduce your flow overall range up here, then suddenly you're going to be working with a much smaller range when you talk about that flow jitter. Hardness jitter and shape jitter, you can probably figure out what they're going to do. So you can jitter the hardness, you can come down here and you can jitter the shape. But keep in mind, like we talked about before, these are settings that are only going to work when you're working with that procedural round brush head. So if you created a brush up here by going to brush and choosing new round brush right here, then you'd have a brush where you have these settings as an option. Or a lot of the built-in brushes are built on this procedural round brush head. But if you create your own round brush that's just from a selection, or that's an image brush, image brushes and intensity brushes, they're not going to have the ability to jitter hardness or shape. So just keep that in mind with these settings. The last setting here under the dynamics menu is this rotation jitter. Obviously it wouldn't matter with the circular brush, but if you had a different shape, you could come in here and suddenly add a jitter to the rotation. So for something like this, we could get something like this. And of course, if we didn't have any rotation on this brush at all, and we were to come here and reduce the spacing, then you're drawing like a nice smooth line. But suddenly if we come in here and we take up that rotation jitter, suddenly we're getting a totally different effect, something more like a ripped paper edge. So you can get some very interesting effects here just by fooling around with this rotation jitter. So working with a brush that has this shape and has some rotation settings and spacing settings that let me create a jagged line like this. Obviously I can paint with this, but I could also use this for some interesting framing effects. So I could just clear that for a second. We can see below this we have this photo layer. So maybe what I'm going to do here is create a mask on the white layer up top. So I'll add a mask to that. Now painting with black directly on the mask, I can show through to that photo below. So very easily I can come in here and paint some interesting framing effects on this photo. Now if I were to undo that, I could even come in here and go to the layer effects for this layer, and maybe I'll add something on here. So maybe I wanted to add in like an outline. Let me click up to outline so I'm seeing the settings. I'll just drag this radius up a little bit here. So we'll go with maybe like 2.5 pixels. Now I'm not seeing anything now because we go all the way to the edge, but if once again I just paint on the mask, then in real time we're going to see that it is applying that outline. So now I can paint on the fly and see that setting change. Now if I want to go in here and experiment with making that wider, we can see that I can bring that up, and on the fly we're applying now that effect. Whoops, paint it on the layer itself. Make sure you're painting on the layer mask, and so then go ahead and we're painting through. We're getting this interesting framing effect, and we also can on the fly have it add in these different layer effects. So very cool. The last two tabs in here that we haven't looked at yet are texture and sub brushes. And I think these are the two most overlooked options in here, mostly because people just don't understand them. But we're going to build upon what we've learned already. I'm going to break this down with simple examples so you can really understand how texture works and how sub brushes work. And this is going to open up even more creative freedom, even more options for you with brushes. So let's jump into it, starting by looking at this texture tab. So if you're just coming to these texture settings for the first time, what you're going to see here under brush nozzles is you're going to see whatever the shape is of your current brush. So we can see right now I have this current brush. Now if I drag something out, we see I have some settings that has this jitter and this rotation. However, when we're talking about the nozzle, that's really just the word they're using for brush stamp brush head. When we talked about the flow setting and how that works at the brush head level, they are using the language nozzle here. So this is just the shape of your brush head, the brush stamp, whatever you want to call it. They're calling it nozzle here. And this nozzle setting here, I think this is actually misplaced a little bit under this texture menu, because you can leave this base texture all alone and still do some really cool things with this brush nozzle setting. Now we're going to talk about that in a minute. But so how does texture come into play? And then how does texture interact with your brush nozzle? So to better illustrate how this works, I've created this image here to use in a simple example. So it's just a simple grid here, goes from A1 to A5 and then has rows going down to E. So keep in mind that this is black and white, and remember how black and white come into play with regard to brushes and intensity. Black's going to show completely, white is going to end up being fully transparent. So keep that in mind. So now I'm going to jump back to that other document here. We'll bring that brush panel back up and we'll go in here under the texture setting. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change this texture. and I'm going to set this texture using that file we just looked at. So here's that letter number grid, and I'm going to go ahead and open that. When you apply a texture, basically then the brush head shape where you're painting, that shape, that brush stroke you're putting down, is going to reveal the texture that you've defined down here. And it's going to reveal that basically as a repeating pattern starting up here in the upper left. So if I start to paint with this brush, first let me just go in here and let's just tuck this up here a little bit. Let's clear this layer. So I'm just going to go Control A and then delete just so we have an empty layer. And I'm going to start to brush. And we can see as I brush, it's slowly putting down that pattern, that image we've defined as our texture. Now, if I turn off this layer here, because we have a white layer in this document, we can see that because I have just black and white in that texture, the white areas are not being brought through. And I can make my brush much bigger here, and we can see how it's painting out that pattern, that image that we have defined as texture. And it's doing it based on the brush strokes I'm putting down with this brush nozzle. Now, if we want to see that a little better, let me come in here and let me do Control A again and delete that. This time I'm going to take the scale and I'm going to bump it way down. So when you save off an image, that's going to be a texture image, whatever scale you have, whether it's 1,000 pixels, then it's going to display as 1,000 pixels. But you can come in and under these texture settings, you can play around with the scale. So if I make this really small, we're going to start to see how that pattern repeats. So I'm going to put it down to 10%. And then I'm going to come in here with the same thing, same brush, and I'm going to start to paint. And now we can see how that pattern's repeating, again, starting in the upper left, but I'm using that brush to reveal that. And now if I just put down one brush stamp at a time, we can see that it is the shape of the brush stamp that is defining. When I make a brush stroke, it's defining where this texture is showing through. So by default, when you have a brush here, you're just putting down a shape of whatever color you're using. But now suddenly when you add texture, you're clipping the patterned layer by the brush itself here. Now, color can still come into play because right now this brush is just using a black paint. But if I were to switch this over to blue or something like that, now you can see the texture that gets revealed based on the texture, but then also based on the color of the brush and based on the shape I'm creating with this nozzle. So the nozzle in your brush stroke is basically almost like clipping mask, if you know a clipping mask, that reveals the layer below, which is this pattern layer made up of your texture. So that is how textures work here when we're talking about this texture setting in Affinity. Now, there's still some other stuff to talk about here and to play around with because we have this nozzle option and we have some different options in here. And then we might talk about, obviously this grid I just did for example purposes, but what sort of textures might make more sense to use here in this texture setting. For the moment, I'm just going to go ahead and remove this texture just so we're back to just plain white. And so it's just going to be governed by our brush head. We're no longer going to be showing a pattern through. And let's see about how nozzles work here. As I mentioned before, the nozzle here is just your brush head shape, but we can come in here and we can add different brush heads and have more than one here that make up a stroke. So I'm going to come in here and add some, and I actually have numbers like we did in the last example, just to make this very simple and obvious for this example. So I'm going to add 1. I'll come in here and I'm going to add the number 2. So again, these are just brush heads that are made up by number shapes. Again, just all black on a white background. That's how you would create any sort of intensity brush here. You could have levels of transparency in here, of course, if you had grayscale and other things in here. So let's just go ahead and add the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'll go ahead and actually get rid of this original one so you can add and remove brush heads. Then let me just hit Control A to select everything on this layer and delete it. And so what happens now, we look at our general settings, we can see that it's going to be placing down these brush heads. And if I look back at this setting right now, I have it just set to random. So set to random now, and my color is blue, so it's going to be painting with blue. But now as I paint, it's randomly putting down different numbers here. So it's randomly deciding which brush head to use. All the other settings and everything that we've talked about before, those are all still being applied, but it's randomly putting down numbers. So this is really cool because this is allowing you now to come on here and have even more variability in terms of the brush you're using, the shape you're using, because you can vary all these settings in here and manipulate the brush head and spacing a little bit. But now we really can, by using brush nozzles, come in here and have different shapes show up in different stamps, all as part of the same brush stroke. So I could come in here and we could lower down the spacing here, but we're getting more variability now because we are putting down different shapes to make up one brush stroke. Now for those last brush strokes, I was just using my mouse, and with it set to random, we saw it was randomly choosing between brush nozzles here. However, if I switch to pressure here, and then I switch to using my Wacom tablet and my pen tool, then suddenly if I'm pressing very lightly as I drag my brush stroke out, it's choosing that first nozzle, then I press a little harder, and then a little harder still, and then I really press down, so then suddenly I can control what brush I'm using without even hitting any buttons or changing my brush. It's just switching between nozzles based on the pen pressure that I'm using. So that's just another example of how sometimes when you have a Wacom tablet, you have even more options open to you, and so you can also use something like pressure here. But let's switch back to random because I have one more pro tip. I think all these brush nozzle things are really pro tips because I don't think too many people are talking about this, but there's another pro tip here. I'll clear my workspace and bring this back to random. When I first started using this, I did think this is pretty cool, but I would like it if there was somehow a way for me to say, hey, use this first brush head 50% of the time. A way to assign percentages here to which brush head it was choosing. Now that is not something that's built in yet, maybe in future Affinity versions, but there is a hack we can do just by taking advantage of our knowledge now of how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this third and fourth one to simplify it so we have one brush head and then we have our second brush head. If I wanted it to put down this second brush head more than this first brush head, I could just add more copies of the same brush head. So if I came in here and added another copy of the 2, and then I come in here and add another copy of your 2 here. So basic math obviously here. So we have 3 copies of this. So 75% of the time now I can make it put down that second brush head, and then only 25% of the time we're getting the other brush head. So that's just another hack here if you want to come in here and duplicate copies of your brush head in here, so you're using that shape more often than the other shapes that are randomly chosen here, you can do that. And of course, for those examples, I was using numbers as my brush nozzles just to make it really obvious, but of course you can use whatever shapes you want. So I went ahead and turned each of the shapes you see on screens now into a brush, and then I loaded each of these as a brush nozzle, and then of course I went in here and adjusted some of the other different settings. And so now if I just turn off this layer and maybe paint on this layer here, we can see that we have this brush that has this really interesting character and edge because we're getting all that variability. So then if I wanted, I could take a brush like this and use it to add a cool edge to this picture here. So maybe I want to come up here and we're going to start in this corner and just click across, and we're going to add a nice little border that sort of follows the lines around the outside of this. And then you know what, you could even come in here and maybe you want to add some texture to the whole thing. So I'll just add another layer below this. And then I have another version of this brush where I just added in a bit of a luminosity jitter, and I'm actually going to paint with this brush, but I'm going to switch the mode here to color dodge. So now I could use this to paint over the whole thing and just sort of bring in this interesting texture. So tons and tons of different ways you can get creative creating brushes, and then you can really just bring that creativity into your workflow and really do a ton of things, especially like adding texture like this as the final touch to a work. Now, of course, we began talking about how you can add base texture here to add texture to an image, and then I got sidetracked talking about nozzles. In that last example, we saw how you can use nozzles to add texture. So that just gives you an idea of the varying levels of creativity and the many different ways you can apply these things. But when you really learn this brush engine, then you can really do whatever works for your workflow. But just to return and put a bow on this, let's look at this base texture example because I showed you some, basic examples so you could understand how it works. But now let's look at more of a practical application. So let's say you were blocking out a landscape like this, so you have some grayscale values in. Now I might come in and I might add a texture brush here. So if I look over at this other thing here, I have this image here, which basically I created this background just using some different brush settings and some different brush heads. So we can create something like this. And then I save this off as an image, and I'm basically going to use this as the textured background because this sort of represents sort of the scattered shapes you might have on a mountainside, which is what we have in our image here. So I'm going to jump back over and I'm going to set that as the texture for this brush. Now this is just a round brush right now, so we don't have any brush nozzles showing because it's just one of those procedural round brushes. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add this texture. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to choose set texture, and we're going to choose that scene we just saw right there. So I think it was actually this one right here that I was just looking at. So I'll go ahead and open that up, and that's going to be the texture for this brush now. So now if I come in here and I paint on this mountainside, so let me make sure I'm on this foreground mountain, and I basically have a mask clipping, so I can't paint outside of it. I can only paint on the mountain. But now that I've added that textured brush, I'll come in here and let me choose a color that's going to be slightly lighter than this, because I'm not going to see if I paint in that color. So I'll come up here and I will grab and I will sample that color. Then let's just make something a little brighter, because we want to sort of see some highlights on this mountain. So now if I come in here and I paint, now suddenly I'm seeing that, and that texture is working well to give a little texture to this image. Now I might want to add some texture to this background here as well. But if I come in there right now, that's this layer, and it's also clipped by a mask. I could start painting on it, but I might not want to paint at the same scale because it's much farther in the distance. So maybe before I do it, I'll just lower my scale down a fair bit, and then I could paint on this mountain here with the same texture, but since it's farther in the background, maybe that's going to be more of a realistic look. So this is just an example of how you can use textures like this, and all the texture settings here under this texture submenu within the brush more menu, and really start to do really creative things with brushes here in Affinity. Okay, so for that last example, I had created my own textured background. But what if you don't want to create your own background? How can we get endless textures? Well, this is really easy, especially nowadays. So let me just jump over to Canva real quick. So if I did something like use Canva's AI tool, where you can come in here and you can ask it to create something for you. So I just used a specific prompt where I'm giving it the sort of thing I know I can easily use in a program like Affinity. So I asked for a grayscale, dust and scratches, grit and grunge overlay on a white background, because I understand that's what we need. We need a grayscale on a white background to use an overlay, a texture overlay like that in Affinity. So I created all these different copies. I ran it once. It gave me 4 options. I decided I wanted 4 more options. So I sort of like this one here. So for this one, I just boosted the resolution. And then I had an image right here I knew I could take back and use immediately in Affinity. So if I jump back to Affinity here, here is the photo itself. Here is the grunge overlay. And of course, that grunge overlay is just saved off in something I can use now if I want to add texture and give this photo a vintage look. So right here on this layer here, don't think I have anything painted on this layer, but if I wanted to use a brush now, let's just come in here and grab this hard round brush. So here's this hard round paint brush here. If I just paint now, let me load some paint on here. We can see I can just paint. It's a hard round brush, but I can add texture to this brush. So let me just hit Control Z to get rid of that stroke. But now I'll come in here under my settings. We'll go to that texture dialog, and I'll just point to that photo. So we're going to come in here. We're going to set texture. We're going to use that vintage grunge overlay that we just created in Canva. Here it is. There it is right there. I could change the scale if I wanted to, but I'm just going to leave the scale how it is set right now. And I could come in here and suddenly I can paint right on here. Now, if I want to swap my foreground and background colors to see what color I think is going to work best, or I could do that alt trick where I alt and then click drag to bring up my color picker. Maybe I'll sample a photo, a color from the photo. So maybe not quite white, but maybe something like that. Then very quickly, I can just paint on this grunge overlay. And so very quickly, just like that, we've taken advantage of our knowledge of the brushes and how texture works, and we can add a lot of character to a photo like this. Of course, I could come in here, I could fool around with raising and lowering the opacity, I could go through the different blend modes, I could change the color I'm using for this overlay. So many different options, but you really can create endless textures that you can then set up as brushes. So I can very easily have like a texture pack of brushes that I can apply a different cool effects to photos very quickly. Okay, we finally made it to the last menu here in the brush dialog, and that is sub brushes. So let's talk about sub brushes and how they work. So I'm going to start by just coming up here, and I'm going to create a simple new round brush. So now we have this new round brush here, and just to make sure we're editing that, I'll double click in here, and we're going to go to this sub brushes menu. So right now I have black as my paint, so if I just paint, it's painting a normal stroke. But what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and add a sub brush, or maybe multiple sub brushes. So in the prior lesson, we saw you could add different nozzles, and when you added a nozzle, each nozzle was a stamp that occurred separately. So one nozzle got put down, and then it moved ahead based on whatever the spacing was set at, and then when it put down another one, it could randomly choose a different stamp head. Sub brushes work a little differently, because with a sub brush, it is going to simultaneously put down the main brush head and then any sub brush head. So they're going to get put down sort of as one stamp at the same time. And then you have some controls in here to control whether they blend together, whether one brush nozzle is erasing the other brush nozzle. So we're going to best see that through an example. So let's go ahead and add something here to this base stamp we have, which is just a circle. So if I made my brush head bigger and we just put down one stamp, we can see it's just a circle. It's got a soft edge. Let me go ahead and take the hardness up. We can adjust this because this is just a procedural round brush. So I just have this normal stamp now. So we're going to see how we can affect this now by adding a sub brush. So for adding a sub brush here, we have two options. We can add a bitmap, so just a pixel based image, or we can just add another procedural round brush. I'll start with this round brush option just so we can start to see how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add round. And so now we have this sub brush, and then we still have the main brush here. Well, I can see the main brush currently has a size of 253. Let's just put it at 100 pixels, just so we have a nice number we can work in terms of math. So we have a 100 pixel main brush. Now the sub brush, if I look at the sub brush now, it is 253 pixels. Now we could come in here and we can sync the size if we want to. So if you want to adjust a sub brush, you want to click on it so it's highlighted. Now we know we're adjusting this brush. And we'll have these options here for whether we want to sync size, sync spacing. So do we want to maintain the relationship of the current size of this brush with the main brush, or do we want them to be able to vary? And then we can also choose blend here. We can choose erase, and then we have some options up here which we'll talk about in terms of drawing and how it's going to put down these stamps. But so first, let's just look and see how this is working. So if I leave it at blend now, and I just stamp something on screen, it's just going to stamp based on whatever the size is of this, because they're just blending together. Now, even though if I go to general and my main brush has a hardness of 100, because my sub brush is even bigger, and if I come in and I edit this brush, I can see that this brush came in with a size of 80. So if I go ahead and make that 100, we see now that we have a nice hard edge, and we see that the size of this brush here, 253, is what's controlling the size of my stamp. Now this is my sub brush. I could take my sub brush all the way down, and I'm only making it 1 pixel now. But if I exit this sub brush editor and I go stamp something, we're still going to see a 100 pixel wide thing, because that is the size of our main brush. And again, currently I have this sub brush set to blend. Well, what if I change the sub brush setting here and I were to change the blending mode to erase? Let's also come in here, let's edit the size of this brush, and then let's make it 50 pixels. So now it's going to be half the width of our main brush. So this is a sub brush. We're set at 50. If I close that, we can see the main brush here. It has a size of a 100. And now when I stamp here, we see that we get this brush with a hole in it. And that is, again, because we've come in here and on our sub brush, we have this blending now set to erase. So let's see what happens if I actually draw out a stroke where I'm putting down multiple stamps, because when I just click once, that's just stamping once. So now I get this little preview here, and it looks like the circle is only going to show up at the end. And that's with the drawing set to at current nozzle. If I change that to behind current nozzle, now look at it. Now suddenly throughout the entire stroke, we're erasing each stamp as we go. So these drawing settings, they can be a little confusing at first, but what you want to do is rely on this preview up here. So this is what current nozzle is going to do. This is what behind current nozzle is going to do. And then we have an end of stroke. And at end of stroke, you may not see it applied until you release your mouse, and then it's going to apply at the time of releasing your mouse. So this is just sort of controlling procedurally behind the scenes what happens. Is it erasing as you put down each stamp? Is it just going to do it all at the end? And because of this, sometimes you get these really different results where at current nozzle is just at the very end maintaining it. All these other ones, it's not maintaining it. So you do get some sort of different results, and you have to sometimes just pay attention to this preview to make sure you understand exactly what's going to happen. Now, because I have sync size and sync spacing set up now, and this brush is 50 and the other brush is 100. So now if I come in here and I start painting, we can see that I'm basically going to erase. Let me go back and see and change this to behind current nozzle. So now when I paint, we can see that basically I'm erasing the center half of this stroke here. And even if I raise the brush size by using my bracket keyboard shortcut, we can see that they raise proportionally. The same thing if I lower the size, it raises and lowers the size of each of these brushes proportionately. So now this one is 30. If I go back and look at the main brush, it is 60, so still basically half the size. So when you come in here and you check on these check boxes here, it's going to sync up the size and the spacing. Now that's when I come on here and I start painting and I use my keyboard shortcuts to adjust the brush size. However, even with these checked, I could come in here and adjust the size of my main brush. So let's push it back up to 100. And then let me go look at my sub brush. So I actually went to 110. Let me look at my sub brush. It's still only at 30. Okay. So if you actually want to maintain that and you have these checked, that's when you actually come in here and you're actually painting on screen and you're using your keyboard shortcuts to make adjustments. But if you just come into one of these menus directly, either the main brush settings or this sub brush settings by using this edit option while it's highlighting, then you are going to adjust whatever proportion this relationship is. Okay, so this sync size and sync spacing only comes in here when you start making adjustments on screen here. But when you're actually directly editing the brush, it's going to affect the proportion. Now I think I could come up here and let's see what happens if I come up here and I change something up here. Then we can see, because I'm using this menu, this contextual menu, and not actually directly editing the brush itself, then this is going to change. But if I'm under this menu where you've double clicked in, then it is sort of changing the proportions. You just got to keep that in mind because this sync size and sync spacing does work. You just have to understand it's protecting things when you're out here, when you're adjusting with your keyboard shortcuts, but when you actually come in under this menu for the sub brush or for the main brush, then you can affect the relationship, okay? So just having these alone checked doesn't lock that relationship if you're in here editing under this menu. You just have to be on screen using this contextual bar up here or using your keyboard shortcuts, and then it will maintain that relationship. But already maybe you can see there's a lot of interesting potential here where now we can sort of put down two different brush shapes at one time and decide whether one's erasing the other, whether they're blending together. So let's play with this a little bit more. So this time, let's add another sub brush. This time we're going to use the add bitmap option, and I'll choose this shape here. So I have this shape brush here. So we're going to go ahead and open this up. And so now we have this in here. And so now we're going to get a totally different preview up here. We can click through to either of these sub brushes, and they're each going to have these independent settings and also the ability to come in here and edit. So what I'm going to do with this brush is, instead of blending like we did, actually we are erasing with this one. So let's blend with this one here. So I'm going to have this one blend. I'm going to turn off this sync size for the moment, sync spacing, because we can see that this brush is currently a lot bigger. So if I were just going to paint a stroke, first let me just go and clear everything for a second. So I'm going to Control A, delete, just so we can see our workspace a little bit better. So if I paint now, we can see that I'm just seeing the start of the brush here, but then I don't see it throughout the stroke. So again, at current nozzle, let's change that to behind current nozzle. Now we're seeing a little bit something different. If we change at the end of the stroke, we won't see anything until the end there. But let's go ahead and play with these brush sizes so we can see a little bit better. So this one is set at 234. Let's make the main brush 100, okay? Because the math sort of, you have to pay attention here to really understand what's going on. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how you can really consider this when you're setting up sub brushes and really consider the sizes of your brushes. So the main brush is going to be 100. Let's go back to these sub brushes here. This one here that is erasing, let's make it so it erases the center portion, so just the center half. So this one here, let's set this size to 50. So that makes it 1/2 of the main brush. And I will come back here so I can see 50, and we want to keep that synced for size and spacing. Now this one here, I want this to be a little bit wider so we start to get some shape at the outside. So let's make this 100. Actually a little bit bigger. Let's go in here and edit the size. Let's make this 125. Now, if we looked at the shape of the brush right there, we see how it's wider than it is tall. So when I just click along here, we're not really going to see it except at the end and the end. However, if we bring some rotation into this brush, because remember with these sub brushes, you can still go on here and fool with all these settings. So let's add a rotation jitter to this brush. And now suddenly we're coming in here and we're getting something totally different. So now I can drag, it's erasing the center, but then boom, it's putting the outside edge. Now, because of the order of these, that erasing that's happening with the first brush, we see it gets erased, but then it applies the second brush, and I lose what's happening there. The other thing I want to stress here, order of operations and the order of brushes matters, and it's going to affect your results. So if I just take this top sub brush and I drag it below the other one, so I'm just going to drag it down. Now let's look what happens when I drag the same stroke. Now I'm drawing it across, and it's keeping a little bit there. But so let's fool around with the settings here. At the end of the stroke, let's change this to behind current nozzle. Now what happens when I drag? Well, now we're getting something totally different. So you really have to pay attention to the settings in terms of how it's drawing things. Let's change this one, behind current nozzle. What if we just do this one at the end of the stroke? Then we get something totally different where we can maintain that whole center strip being erased. So you can get crazy different results just based on the order you have things being applied, and then also the drawing setting. So you really have to pay attention, do some practice strokes so you get what you like. Now, if I really love this effect right now, then I would want to come in here, and I'm looking at the sub brush editor right now. So let me just go ahead and close out of that. Here's the main brush here. So I'm going to come back to that main brush, and let's do a save as, and let's call this, let's just call it jagged edge, no center. I don't know, something that's going to make sense to you. And so now we have all these settings, including the sub brushes, saved. So I could switch off. Let me hit Control A, delete everything on this layer. I could just be using a main brush here now, but now when I switched back to this brush, because I saved those settings, I have it doing exactly what I want. So there really are tons and tons of potential things you can do with sub brushes like this. Let's just play a little bit farther. So I'm going to come back into the same one here, but let me just come here and click on this. So I'm going to double click to bring it open, and I'm going to do a save as, and I'm just going to do copy. That way I'm working on a copy. We're not going to risk losing that first one that we like, because I like the way that one's working here. But now with this copy, we'll go back in here. Let's add yet another sub brush. Once again, I'll choose a bitmap. I have this fragments brush, and it's got some texture built into that. And by texture, I say we have varying levels of gray in here. So some of this is going to be more transparent than other parts of it. So I could go ahead and I can open that. And again, got to pay attention to the size here. Main brush is 100. If we look at the sub brushes, 50, that's half of that. That's keeping the center. And if I turned off sync sizing like I did here, now I have to keep in mind, I don't have sync sizing turned on for this first brush. So if I were to come in here now and draw something, but let's say I adjusted the brush size first. So let's make the main brush even bigger. Then suddenly I'm losing that outer brush, that last brush, that sort of owl head shaped brush, or what I think that's what I called it there, this rectangular one here, because it stayed at 125, even though I made my general brush way bigger. So let's take this way down to 100, and I'll go back, to these sub brushes here, and I see that everything has gotten a little mixed up, so you have to be a little careful here when you're fooling around with the sizes. So general brush, back to 100, this brush here, I want to be half of that, so let me come in here and edit this to 50. We want that to have a size of 50. Let's go back into this brush here, 125, that's good. And again, maybe I do want to sync size and spacing now because I like that relationship. And then with this last brush here, I do want it to be even bigger, so let's set this one, but maybe not quite as big as it is now, so let's set it down to something more like 200. Okay, and with this one here, maybe I want to come in here and give it a flow jitter, give it a size jitter. Maybe let's give it an accumulation jitter and scatter it slightly on both axes, right? We could give it a luminosity jitter, so whatever we want, and then come in here and check the setting. And again, remember order of operations, so if we want to go ahead and play around and see how we can get it to act differently, we can come around and we can fool with all these different settings. So this one here, again, Just click in on it. Let me come into general. Let's take the flow way down because I don't want it to be quite as bright as it is. I just sort of want to give it some outer texture to the brush like that. So again, very interesting results, and you can start to see how there's so much you can potentially do with something like this. So you really have to play around. So here's just another final example of a sub brush I created. So I sort of have this neon effect here. So with this brush, I was just using circles, but I was very careful about the order of operations. So I have a circle that's sort of erasing that center part, and then another circle that puts down after that a stamp of color there. And so I have these different colors, I have these different opacities. You can get very creative with the effects you're able to do with these sub brushes. And then you can combine that with your other knowledge of Affinity. So on the layer above here, I just have some layer effects being applied, an outer glow and a Gaussian blur. So if I were to paint on that layer, then suddenly in real time, I can see those layer effects also applied. So you can get some really cool results with sub brushes in Affinity. So make sure you check it out. So hopefully now you're starting to understand all the amazing potential that exists with the paintbrush tool in Affinity. It's not good for just painting, but also for adding texture effects and finishing touches to your work, adding clouds and other atmospheric effects, traditional photo editing, creative photo editing, framing effects, and so much more. You didn't just watch the whole video, did you? Maybe you skipped ahead. Well, regardless, I hope you took something positive and helpful away from this video. If you like videos like this, feel free to subscribe to this channel. And also don't forget I have that free downloadable guide to the brush tool down below, so you can get that in the comments. Thanks again for stopping by. Hope to see you soon.
Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that. Spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas. Think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past.